Good morning, everyone. Can I welcome you to the second meeting in 2014 of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Can I remind everyone in the room to switch off their mobile phones and devices because they do affect the broadcasting system. But having said that, some of our committee members will be using their tablets to consult their papers. Can I welcome Patrick Harvey to this meeting? Agenda item 1 is the Housing Scotland Bill. And today we're going to hear evidence from 2 panels of witnesses on the Housing Scotland Bill at stage 1. So on our first panel, may I welcome Rosemary Brocci, Policy Manager, Shelter Scotland. I hope I've pronounced that right. David Bookbinder, Head of Policy and Public Affairs, the Chartered Institute of Housing in Scotland. Andy Young, Policy Manager for the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. And Alan Benson, Director of Glasgow and the West of Scotland Forum of Housing Associations. So to start this session in questioning, Adam, would you like to start?
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, everyone. The Scottish Government's declared vision is that all people in Scotland live in high-quality, sustainable homes that they can afford and that meet their needs. To what extent do you think the Bill's provisions support this vision? If anyone wants to start off.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off. I think that because it's a very wide-ranging bill, there's a huge number of areas which very much contribute to improving housing and housing standards across private rented sector, the owner-occupied sector, and indeed, obviously, the social sector. So, whilst only certain parts of the bill relate to physical standards, particularly in relation to owner-occupied and private rented sector, the overall issues about rights, about obligations, about an improved housing system across the sectors is very much reflected in almost every part of the bill.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to give evidence today. Shelter Scotland very much supports the aims of this bill and certainly feel that many of the measures in it are set out and will achieve those aims. I think as we're giving evidence today, you'll see that we have a few concerns with some of the areas and would suggest that the committee might want to look for strengthening in certain areas. And if you've had the opportunity to look at our briefing, you'll see that there are a few areas where we think that an opportunity has been missed to strengthen this bill. And that's particularly in regard to provision of accommodation, both temporary accommodation and permanent homes for people who find themselves homeless, and also in regards to safety standards in the private rented sector.
Yes, thank you for inviting the SFH here to give evidence. We support the broad aims and principles of the bill, but I would agree with David. The bill generally deals with the management of tenancies, etc., rather than the actual supply, which is really more linked to what you asked.
Good morning. On behalf of the Glasgow West Scotland Forum, thanks for the invitation to give evidence this morning. I think, as been said before, I think we would agree with the general principles of the bill. It's certainly moving in the right direction. And I think our comment is that housing bills don't come around very often, so whenever they do, it's essential that we try and deal with some of the real difficult housing issues that still exist in Scotland. So just backing up what the previous speakers have said, there are maybe some issues of detail that perhaps later on in the session we can discuss that, you know, from our point of view in terms of the private rented sector, for example, there's not much in the bill to try and improve standards, which we think is a major issue within that sector if it's going to be used for people in housing needs on an increasing basis.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm sure my colleagues will pick up on some of these issues that you've mentioned, but if I could just press you on the issue of the Scottish Government expects one of the main outcomes of the bill to be sustainable communities. Now, do you agree that the provisions in the bill will support this outcome?
I guess one of the there are a number of measures, as the committee will be aware, help landlords have more flexibility on allocations and to deal more effectively with antisocial behaviour. Both those things certainly could be said to have the aim of helping maintain sustainable, cohesive communities. But and we very much welcome the measures that are there. I don't think we should over-egg the extent to which either of those sets of provisions on both allocations and antisocial behaviour will, dramatically change the situation. Already social landlords have a good degree of flexibility on allocations, and there's some welcome clarification and some more minor amendments to the existing legislation in the bill. And very much we welcome things like the measure to allow landlords to take age into account when allocating. We think that that's a common sense measure. So some very welcome measures there. On antisocial behaviour, I don't think any single measure on antisocial behaviour will change the world. It will, serious antisocial behaviour cases will always be tricky to deal with, but there are some significant improvements which will help. And any way in which legislation can help landlords deal with antisocial behaviour is going to contribute to happier and more settled communities.
I think, your question obviously pointing towards the management and the social rented sector, and in terms of sustainable communities, David's identified the antisocial behaviour measures in this bill. And I think, what Shelter Scotland's view is that we agree that much more needs to be done to ensure that social landlords make the best supply of a limited social stock. But we do have some concerns about some of the proposals, specifically around eviction processes, which we think may have negative consequences potentially, given how they're defined in the bill. So we do have some concerns, but we also agree that responses to antisocial behaviour should be strong, consistent and effective. And we don't want to see any detrimental change to housing law that would affect tenancy rights really as a knee-jerk reaction. We want to make sure that the responses that are there in the bill can be used effectively by landlords.
I think David's right. Again, agreeing with him again, it's important to realise that these measures alone aren't a panacea to tackle antisocial behaviour. It will always require a multi-agency approach, always.
I think our forum represents community-based housing associations in Glasgow and West Scotland. We would like to argue that we've been providing sustainable and cohesive communities for the last 35 years or so. And I think from our perspective, the major issues are maintaining that process. And we feel, to some extent, under siege, that it's becoming more difficult to maintain, and all the good work that's happened in the past. So anything that this bill can cover in terms of, reversing that trend, I think there's a lot of, for example, added costs now being expected to be met by the rent payer in our communities that wasn't expected in the past. The cost of, for example, maintaining waiting lists, which was part of previous legislation, was a good idea, but it costs an organisation like the one I work for £6,000 a month, and that's money that perhaps could be better spent, because you have situations where 150 voids in a year for our individual organisation, about 1,000 people on a waiting list. So I think it would be useful to get into that kind of debate and see how best whatever existing resources could be used. But I think the general thrust of maintaining stable and communities is obviously a good one.
Thanks very much for that. The final question I've got is with regards to the Scottish Government's consultation process. Are you content with the way that was conducted in the process of consultation? Any issues with it?
There's been a very comprehensive consultation process, taking different issues as part of usually different consultation processes, whether it be right to buy, social sector tenancies and allocations, major consultation on the future of the private rented sector. So I think by and large we certainly couldn't say that there's been any lack of consultation. It's been very comprehensive. There are obviously one or two measures in the bill towards the end of the bill where there wasn't prior consultation, and obviously we won't go into the detail on those now, but that means that some of us are not always in a position to comment in detail on some of those newer provisions relating, for instance, to the Scottish Housing Regulator. We will need more time, and there is more time, thankfully, between now and stage 2 to look at some of those provisions. But by and large, there's very, very considerable consultation.
Yes, I think we'd agree with David there again. It's consultation on different parts of the bill has been conducted within different teams in Scottish Government, so it hasn't been one single consultation. I think we'd echo the fact that there are things that have appeared in the bill that perhaps we weren't expecting as a result of that consultation process, so we will need some time to consider those. I'd perhaps just say that this approach to consulting on a bill perhaps has meant that there are some additional measures which we would have promoted, I think, through that consultation process, which we didn't have the opportunity to, but I'm hoping would be possible to consider by this committee at stage 1 and 2.
Would you like to be more specific as to what you're talking
Well,
about?
there are particular areas, for example, around electrical safety in the private rented sector, which there wasn't an opportunity during consultation to raise, and perhaps some of the other areas that we're identifying, that didn't really fit into any of the consultative areas that we would have wanted to respond to.
It's a fair point that there were issues that weren't consulted on, but on a positive note, the issues that were consulted on, the consultation was very thorough and allowed our members to feed into it.
I think we would echo that and say that in terms of the pre-legislative consultation, I think some of the views that were expressed by our members were actually taken on board when it came to the drafting of the bill. So we're pleased with that process. The issue of probationary tenancies, for example, was one that our members commented on, and that hasn't appeared in the bill. So obviously someone listened during the pre-legislative process.
Thanks very much.
Right. Anybody got anything else on that? General questions? Okay, if we move on to right to buy, Alex, you've got some questions on that.
Yes, thank you. Of course, right to buy is one of the headline, or abolishing right to buy is one of the headline objectives of the bill. So, in the first instance, could I ask what benefits you see coming from the abolition of right to buy?
I think the key benefit has to be supply. Whilst in recent years, for reasons everyone's familiar with, haven't seen as many sales as in the earlier part of the going back through the 80s and 90s, the certainty that this will give local authorities in their strategic planning role and all landlord local authorities and housing associations affected by the right to buy, the certainty that this will give them in terms of knowing what their planning, business planning, knowing what rental income they're going to have, and indeed, of course, knowing how much stock they're going to have to use for allocations, homelessness, etc., is a huge benefit. Ultimately, local right to buy was an individual right. It's very, very difficult to use it in any strategic way, and it really its time, I think, in Scotland has very much come. Even if, as I said, sales are not enormously high at the moment, that can change in the future, making greater inroads into removing supply. So it's a hugely welcome measure for CIH Scotland.
On that issue particularly, could you bring this down to simple numbers? How many vacancies do you expect to be created by the abolition of right to buy?
I don't have those figures.
Those who are being denied the right to buy, for the most part, will just continue to be tenants. There's a deep assumption in this argument that by abolishing right to buy, we massively increase the availability of housing stock. So how many vacancies will be created by the abolition of right to buy?
Over time, I mean, it's an oft-used argument in favour of right to buy that a tenant who buys doesn't vacate the property, and if they hadn't bought, they might not have immediately vacated property. But if that's a short-term argument, the longer-term argument is a no-brainer that supply is increased by maintaining council and housing association stock at its maximum. I mean, I don't have figures to hand, although I'd be very happy to supply them, and I think Scottish Government has already supplied those in the policy memorandum that accompanied the bill, but it's undoubted that it has a beneficial impact on supply over the longer term.
But we're not talking about a situation where we're currently, I think the sales rate is about 1,000 a year at the moment in Scotland. So if we abolish right to buy, we're not creating 1,000 vacancies a year. In fact, we're creating a figure that's very, very much smaller than that, if any, initially. It's
a longer term move. You know, as I've said, if you look at what the impact of right to buy and supply over the longer term, it's undoubted what contribution it's made to depriving councils and housing associations of the ability to house people in housing need.
I'd agree with everything that David has said, and perhaps just to add to that, that it's not just the volume of stock that is lost through right to buy, it's also the types of homes that are lost. I say lost, I mean from the social sector. Very often we've seen the homes that are the most desirable, the best maintained in the best areas, and often homes which have particular characteristics which are sold or to their tenants, and therefore are no longer available to social tenants in the future. And I think being able to secure those properties for the future is very important.
The longer term issue is really important. A study was done a couple of years ago, off the top of my head, I can't remember the names of the people that carried it out, but I could certainly supply committee with the details of some horror stories about ex-right to buy properties now in the private rented sector for rents that are approaching double what the social rent will be. And the study suggested that it's cost UK-wide, it's costing in excess housing benefit up to £2 billion a year to the public purse. So that's one of the longer term issues that David was referring to.
I think that there are, working for a housing association, there are real practical issues around right to buy in terms of trying to manage the business if your asset base is at risk all the time. I think that's one of the issues. I think in terms of vacancies, you're right, it won't suddenly create a number of, 1,000 new vacancies every year because tenants will still be in those houses, but at least the house, there'll be no chance of those houses being lost to the sector. And I think over time that is an important issue. I think as time has gone on, and right to buy from our perspective is the issue is the discount. If people want to buy a house that they've lived in our community, at full market value and become owner occupiers, then that's fine. But I don't think that's what happens in reality. I think what happens in reality is that the discount gets used. People move the property into the private rented sector, and as Andy's just said, double the rent. And I think that's a problem that's never been addressed over the last 30 years.
The proposal to abolish right to buy includes with it a 3-year notice period. And when we discussed this with officials last week and asked them the reason for that, they cited human rights as one of the issues. Given that a right is being taken away, they believed that a 3-year notice period was appropriate. What are your views on the notice period, and whether you think it's a human rights issue to have a notice period for the abolition?
I think in taking away an existing right, there probably are, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I think there probably are human rights implications, and I can understand why ministers have been keen to look at allowing, wanting to be sure they're acting reasonably in this situation to make sure that tenants have got a chance to plan ahead and look at their options. We think that a period of 2 years would still enable tenants to do that, consider whether they want to buy, and then progress the purchase if they so wished, but while still allowing the government to be seen to act reasonably in terms of human rights implications. 2 years rather than 3. Again, it gives landlords more certainty and stability about future finances. It also perhaps limits the period through which there might be some kind of peaking of sales. But we think 2 years would be a very reasonable period.
Yes, I think the period of notice that's given is excessive. I don't think it's necessary to give tenants that long, and actually potentially could be quite damaging, not just from the point of view of the peaking of sales, as David mentions, but we also know, and this has been evidenced before, that when the right to buy has been restricted or limited, there are companies out there who act and who prey upon almost vulnerable tenants to persuade them to purchase their property, when actually it might not be the right thing for them to do financially or in terms of their security. And I think if we give those companies, if we give people too long an opportunity to purchase, we actually may see some detrimental effects on tenants themselves as well. We think that clearly we need to give people long enough to make an informed decision and to choose whether it's the right thing for them to do to purchase their property. But 3 years is very much too long for that. And in fact, we suggested that potentially 6 months to a year might be more appropriate, given that as this bill proceeds through the committee stages and through Parliament before receiving royal assent, this issue is likely to get a fair deal of press coverage. It's going to be a common knowledge, and I think people will be considering their options really from now onwards, whether or not purchasing is the right thing for them. So I think we would agree with CIH here that 3 year notice period is too long.
It's probably worth pointing out that 3/4 of the respondents to the consultation also thought that 3 years was too long. And I would agree with Shelter that a year would seem more appropriate. It puzzles me slightly that the Scottish Government seem a little bit concerned about legal challenges to this when right to buy is such a complex, multi-layered situation at the moment that there are lots of other situations within it that are probably more open to legal challenge than the notice period. For example, people who live in pressured area status just now, their right to buy effectively is ended just now. So I would have thought that would provoke more of a chance of a legal challenge than what you're suggesting.
Just echo what's been said previously. I'm not a lawyer, so can't really comment on the human rights issue, but we do think 3 years is too long. I think in our previous response, we reckon a year. I'd agree what Rosemary said on behalf of Shelter, that it does seem a long period of time to allow that right to end. So I think the vast majority of our members feel that a year would be an appropriate timescale.
Just on the issue of pressured areas, of course, as you point out, those who are in pressured areas will not get the right to buy unless that status is lifted prior to the end date. So, as a consequence, do you think the bill adequately addresses the position in which these individuals might find themselves, or is it necessary for the bill to look further at the situation of people who would like to buy but are in pressured areas and will remain in pressured areas until the right is gone?
To be honest, I don't think you can legislate for every little connotation within the right to buy situation at the moment. For me, it would be quicker and cleaner just to draw a line under it.
Do you think there's a danger that if we try to legislate for every area that we create anomalies that will then be exploited through the courts?
Possibly.
I think I would add to that the pressured area status is there for a reason. It's been brought in for a very significant and important reason, and I think if we try and undermine that if the committee decides to undermine that by trying to alter this abolition, I mean, I think really the consensus from the consultation that was carried out was that the sooner it's ended, the better, actually.
One other issue on right to buy, coming at it from a different angle entirely, is that regardless of whether you approve or not, right to buy has actually been an income stream for social landlords. There has been money coming in as a result of properties being sold. Do you think that will have any implications for social landlords when they lose that income stream?
The indications and the worst affected, if you like, are likely to be the larger kind of stock transfer type organisations. The indications are that it'll be either a positive or a neutral effect, so that they're really not concerned about loss of receipts at all.
I mean, obviously, I can't comment on the landlord's perspective on that, but I would say that even removing the right to buy, still, and landlords are still able to sell if they so choose, and that those sales that they would make would be planned sales. They would actually be able to plan for them and sell the stock that they thought was appropriate for a sale. So I think if a landlord is in a position where it's needing to raise income and they consider that selling off stock is the best way to do it, they're not precluded from doing that by this abolition.
Thank you very much.
Can I ask, if you want a shorter period, say a year rather than 3 years, can you see any difficulties in that? I mean, and even if it's 3 years, do you see that there's going to be a rush of tenants wanting to buy within that 3 years or 1 year? Or have there been any indication from tenants that that might be the case?
I think the honest answer to that is we really just don't know. We really just don't know. You know, there always is a danger that if you make it a year, there will be a stampede, but in reality, I really can't see that happening. But of course, that's a risk. That is a risk, no question.
And I think, as I said a few minutes ago, that I think that the committee will need to make that consideration of what is an appropriate time to allow people to take advice, to consider properly what the implications, because it's not just the purchase price and the cost of the mortgage, it would be also the maintenance cost. And I think we have seen, and certainly Shelter Scotland sees cases where people have bought perhaps rashly in the past without taking proper advice. They haven't fully considered all the costs in running and maintaining an owned house and have got into difficulty and trouble later on, particularly when, I mean, one of the implications we've talked about, the impact of the cost of previously bought houses, right to buy houses in the private rented sector, but we also know there's a significant implication for the repair and maintenance of homes in blocks where some of them are owner occupied, some of them are owned by social landlords. And I think potentially the owners can find themselves with very significant bills for common repairs, which they hadn't anticipated. So we would want to encourage anybody who was considering purchasing their right to buy property to take proper advice. But as I said before, we also are aware that there are a number of companies who are pretty much, urging people to buy before it's too late. And I think we want to limit the impact that those companies might have on tenants.
The companies?
Companies who are persuading tenants they'll help them facilitate a mortgage, potentially even buy to then let, sort of mortgage to rent it's called. So you would be persuaded to purchase your property. It would be purchased by the company and then they would let it back to you. And that's a problem we have seen in the past, and it's seen across the owner-occupied sector.
And so would that position be helped by reducing the time?
I think potentially yes. I think if we allow a longer time period, there's potential for these kinds of companies to perhaps build up more of a inroad into tenants who may not be considering their options quite as much as we would like them to.
And in terms of the housing associations, do you think that in terms of relationships with your bank and in terms of borrowing, the right to buy will assist because you won't have a depletion of your stock and your asset, if you like?
Yeah, I think that, I said earlier, I think that it's much easier to do your own internal business planning if you know your asset base is not at risk. So that's just bound to help. Over the years, the numbers in terms of right to buy have reduced significantly, but it is still an issue for us that you want to be able to plan ahead, knowing the number of stock that you've got and budgeting accordingly. So I think in that respect it can only help.
Anybody else got any questions on right to buy? Okay, if we move on to part 2 of the bill, which is social housing. Mark, you've got some questions on that.
Thank you, Convener. Just to ask the panel on their views on how the bill would amend the reasonable preference provision relating to allocation policy for social landlords.
I think when it comes down to it, it's a very modest tinkering with the reasonable preference criteria. Very sensibly, for many, many years now, the criteria have included people coming out of homelessness and people living in unsatisfactory housing conditions, which actually is about almost any kind of circumstance that people might find themselves in. Those remain with very, very slight amendment to clarify that such people would of course need to be in housing need. There's a very welcome addition of people who are in social housing who are under-occupying. I think we all understand the reasons for that. But it's a modest and very sensible amendment to reasonable preference, but it's not a radical change, and I don't think any of us felt that there was a need for radical change.
Yeah, I think Shelter Scotland's long argued that the reasonable preference groups that are currently in legislation are outdated and really out of sync with current allocation practice and with the way that social housing is currently allocated. So we think this is a positive move in that it will give landlords the scope to prioritise the groups as they reflect local need. But we would say, however, that we would want to make sure that the use of this was monitored and that the particularly social housing regulator or groups like ourselves would keep an eye basically on how reasonable preference categories locally were being identified to make sure that on an ongoing basis that housing need was being met.
I think David nailed it earlier on actually when he said don't over-egg this, because in practice we really don't think this is going to make an awful lot of difference to housing association allocation policies.
I think we would agree with that. I think it's a very modest change, and I think the definition of unmet housing needs as it exists in the bill could be doing with a bit of clarification.
I mean, I think we all understand the reason for including the line on under-occupied properties because of the effect that's having on a lot of tenants. But just on the point of removing large families or overcrowded properties from the criteria, do you think that will have a negative impact on some larger families or people who are struggling in houses which are too small for their needs?
I mean, those people may well, if they are overcrowded, I mean, a large family by itself may not be in any housing need at all. If they are in housing need, then they would very much come under, I can't imagine an allocations policy which wouldn't include overcrowding, for example, under unsatisfactory housing conditions. So in practice, I don't see that making any difference. As Rosemary has alluded to, it was quite outdated to see it isolated as a category in reasonable preference because it had no relation to housing need in itself. But whereas such a household was in housing need, I'm sure that they would be taken, they would be covered by the allocations policy under unsatisfactory housing.
The bill also gives Scottish ministers the power to make regulations on the category of people that should be included in allocation policies. Do you think that's a necessary power? If you do, what types of categories of people do you think should be specified?
I think the three key groups that are currently identified in legislation, homeless households, those living in unsatisfactory living conditions, and as we said, those with unmet housing need. I mean, I think that really does cover the broad range of people who would be given any kind of reasonable preference. Perhaps just would like to echo that the unmet housing need perhaps is a little bit woolly and perhaps could do with some clarification.
The bill also allows social landlords to take into account an applicant's age for the first time, while not affecting the overall policy, to give priority for certain house types. Just to ask the panel's views on that and how that could assist in allocations.
I'll unashamedly go first on this one because this is a measure that CIH Scotland specifically sought. We'd had local authority and housing association landlords, coming to us over the years saying that if they, for instance, wanted to house 5 or 6 older households in a group of non-specialist ground floor houses, for example, where the location seemed particularly suitable and for other sensitive allocations reasons, it seemed the right thing to do, that they couldn't lawfully do that. Couldn't say that those 5, 6 houses were going to go just to older people. So we think it's a genuinely sensible measure, especially taken alongside the bill's strong reminder that all landlords have got to comply with equalities legislation, which means they can't discriminate against any group, whether it's younger people or any other group. So we're very pleased to see this measure.
And this might be one of the few areas in this bill where you're going to see some disagreement, I think. We don't agree that this is a necessary measure. It wasn't one that was consulted on, and we didn't have the opportunity to respond to this in the consultation process. We think that the current legislative framework already allows sufficient flexibility for landlords to take these kinds of issues into account where there is a real need for them to be taken into account. And we think that the fundamental principle of social housing allocation should be based on a framework of need and the circumstances that households are in, and not on the characteristics of households. You'll see the homelessness legislation and the 2012 amendment, 2012 commitment made that change in principle as well, and we wouldn't like to see allocations now taking on a characteristic of a household as being a reason for giving people giving people a preference for housing over another group. It's not the policy intention, as David said, that these allocation rules could be used in a discriminatory way, but we want to be certain that they're not used in a discriminatory way, and we don't see a reason to have age listed as a specific reason that allocations can be made in this bill.
It should help with sensitive lettings, and it should help to avoid what you might call lifestyle clashes. But as somebody else alluded to, because age is a protected characteristic, I really wonder how this is going to operate in practice, to be honest. And that's partly what I meant earlier when I was talking about the 3-year notice period and almost being frightened of a legal challenge on that, and yet to include something like this in the bill, which for me is wide open for a legal challenge at some point, is a little bit contradictory. But I can understand why it was included, and we did support it. But in practice, I really wonder how readily it will be used.
We would support it. I mean, and I think it's one of those areas where it concurs with proposals we put forward to the government's pre-legislative consultation. I think the new provision would help social landlords to make greater use of sensitive lettings and indeed promote greater tenant sustainability. So we think it's a good measure.
And last question, just ask if you have any comments on the bill's provisions related to qualifying periods for joint tenancies, subletting, assignations and successions.
We're pleased to see these again without being, without over dramatising the extent to which abuse occurs in these areas. Most landlords will have cases where people have moved in the day before a relative dies or something like that. So it's a very welcome measure just to protect and in cases, for instance, of assignation. The ability, the measure that gives a landlord an ability to refuse an assignation where it doesn't comply with the person who would benefit isn't in housing need. This has got to be welcome when social housing is in such short supply, and we're very much welcome in the succession, assignation, etc. provisions the requirement for the prospective beneficiary of that succession or assignation to have told the landlord at the time that they were moving in that they now live there. That's a very, very significant measure which we welcome.
Yeah, I think it's again pointing out that it's not as this perception of queue jumping probably isn't as widespread as some people might think it is. That said, I think it's right that the loophole should be closed. David, I'm pretty sure our two organisations wanted to go further when it came to assignation. We wanted to remove the tenant's right to assign the tenancy and instead confer power on the landlord to be able to allow it if necessary. But yeah, we agree with all of these. Yeah.
Okay, Mary, if we move on to then antisocial behaviour in this part 2 of the bill.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted to ask some questions around the Scottish secure tenancies. And the bill makes provision that would allow landlords to create an SST or convert an SST to a short SST if there's a history of antisocial behaviour. And I'd be interested in your views on whether you think the proposals are both appropriate and proportionate.
This one, I think certainly Shelter Scotland really does believe that antisocial behaviour, which we know can blight communities, cause misery, cause distress to individuals and to neighbours, should be tackled, and it should be tackled quickly and effectively. But I'm afraid we do have concerns about the way that this section is drafted, particularly in terms of what constitutes antisocial behaviour as it's defined here. And really what evidence would be required to result of antisocial behaviour to result in somebody losing their tenancy or their security of tenure in this. We would want to make sure that this section of the Act, if it's going to be effective, does ensure that there's sufficient checks and balances to make sure that this part could not be used inappropriately and wouldn't unfairly penalise vulnerable tenants.
I think the measures are indeed proportionate. That landlords, social landlords, are heavily regulated, of course, and I think it's a question of whether the system, if you like, and the law trusts landlords to use measures sensitively. Most landlords that we come across, the exasperation that they feel is usually in long-standing, very, very difficult cases, not isolated incidents of somebody causing too much noise or something like that. It's protracted cases which have gone on a long time, perhaps through lack of witnesses, lack of satisfactory evidence where people are afraid to come forward. So whilst these measures don't in any way solve all those issues, they do give landlords some additional options, and we strongly believe that landlords only have an interest in using these measures where they really want to have struggled to take action and protect the majority of tenants living around the property in question from extreme distress and upset for them. I think any consideration of antisocial behaviour measures shouldn't just consider the impact on the alleged perpetrator's rights, it should also consider the impact on the rights of people living around and in the community to enjoy their property peacefully.
I don't necessarily disagree with Shelter on this, actually. I think some clarity would be welcome, actually. Some clarity around what is antisocial behaviour and what is the evidence test for actually going through this. We flagged this up at quite an early stage in the consultation, actually. But we do agree with the measure.
I think we would agree that giving more flexibility to landlords is a good thing, but part of the one of the consequences of the bill and the briefing note that we've issued to our members is to talk through with housing staff the implementation issues, because I think there are some practicalities that would have to be worked through in terms of how such a power would be used in practice. I think we've a fair way to go to bottom that out.
So if the government produced guidance on how this particular aspect would be used, is there something in particular you would like to see in the guidance? Do you think the guidance needs to be really quite specific and detailed in what evidence you can use and the length that you need to go back to examine that evidence?
We'd be actually interested in seeing if there would be, almost on primary legislation, a kind of a check or a balance in this to identify what the burden of proof would be to penalise somebody under this part. This is not to say that we don't take antisocial behaviour very, very seriously, but it should be effective. It should the means to address it should be effective, and they shouldn't create unintended consequences.
We would favour advisory guidance, good practice guidance that, for instance, gives examples of the sorts of behaviour that might be appropriate to take into account and examples of the sorts of behaviour that might not be appropriate. But to legislate for every single circumstance, on the face of the bill or in regulations, I think would be very would be very risky. And if I may, I'll give a quick example of this. There is a measure in the bill that suggests that where, for instance, somebody might be suspended from receiving an offer of housing because of antisocial behaviour, that the ministers will have the power in regulations, first of all, to set the maximum period that you can be suspended for, which seems perfectly reasonable for ministers to do that, and secondly, to set the period, how far back a landlord can go in considering the behaviour that's taken place. And again, we think that's a matter of good practice. There is, CIH itself has some good practice guidance on suspensions out, and you can see situations where it wouldn't be reasonable for landlords to go back many years and penalise somebody for behaviour a long time ago, but for that to be legislated for. So if you name on the face of the bill or in regulations the maximum period you can go back, you're really trying to legislate for something that we think would be better left to landlords' discretion, because there might always be odd cases where it is appropriate to go back a decent amount of time. So we just have to, I think, be careful not to over-legislate for every type of circumstance when it comes to antisocial behaviour.
Potentially, but perhaps just, if I'm allowed, just to add to that, I do think that we need something a bit stronger that defines this legislation. And just as you can use an example like that, you could also possibly point to an equivalent example where such a measure could be used to unfairly penalise a tenant. I mean, we have to accept that people are allowed the opportunity to reform and to improve their behaviour over time. And we also have to acknowledge that this bill sets the definition very, very broadly and potentially could include somebody who's just living in that household, not the tenant themselves. It could be somebody even visiting the household. So, I think that there is a concern here that this might be open to misuse or may not be used appropriately in some circumstances.
Any of the other panel members have any further comments? No? Well, can I just finally ask around the protection for tenants, because the bill also makes provision for protection for tenants who are on short SSTs. Is there any other protection for tenants with short SSTs required, or are you content that what's in the bill is adequate?
Certainly welcome the measures that are in the bill, particularly in increasing the period of time for which somebody can have a triple ST to enable them to really have the support that's required to progress to a full secure tenancy.
I think a landlord having to give tenants a reason why it's ending a short tenancy is a positive move as well.
Thank you.
Can I just go back on the terms of the age suggestions? That's what's previously happened, wasn't it? I mean, you could allocate before in terms of age. I mean, as MSPs, one of the major things that we get is antisocial behaviour, and people have been moved into a block that was traditionally a block for older people, had been in the past. So is this going back to what happened before?
As long as I can remember, you've not been able to allocate, you've not been able to take age into account in allocations, and I would have to double check and get back to the committee whether that was part of the 87 Act or later, and was it part of the 2001 Act. I rather think it goes back to the 87 Act, and happily clarify that for the committee. So this is removing that prohibition on taking age into account.
But perhaps you may be thinking of a situation where landlords can already make decisions about how they allocate their property based on the type of property that is. So clearly, if you've got a property, a block of adapted property or property with particular characteristics that make it more suitable for particular types of occupants, then you can already distinguish people from a waiting list and allocate them to that property if it's suitable. So I think, as I said before, I think there is already sufficient flexibility in allocations that doesn't require this addition of age as a category.
Sorry, I need to, if I may, the provision at the moment that Rosemary is referring to relates to accommodation that is specially designed, for example, for older people. I think the whole idea of this provision is to enable a degree of flexibility in relation to accommodation that is mainstream, ordinary accommodation that isn't specially designed, and that's where the barrier is at the moment.
In terms of the anti-social behaviour proposals, do you see tenancy agreements being written up now differently or rewritten to be more specific about what constitutes antisocial behaviour in the view of the landlord?
What comes out at the end of it. I think the tenancy agreement would be based on whatever guidance you give to us, I think. But going back to your previous question, I go back further than David. And you're right, you know, councils and housing associations used to actually advertise, you know, blocks for the over 55 seemed to be a common. Quite what happened when you turned from 54 to 55, I'm not too sure. I'm about to find out. But they couldn't do that now. They couldn't do that now under the Equality Act anyway. So in that sense, we can't turn the clock back to that. Okay, if we move on, Gordon.
I want to continue the subject of antisocial behaviour, and in particular the bill intends to make evictions simpler in cases where an individual has been convicted of illegal activity that affects the community. How will this address some of the problems that social landlords currently experience in seeking to evict tenants with a Scottish secure tenancy who have been convicted of antisocial behaviour?
Well, that particular provision about eviction after conviction will apply only in a very small number of cases, but in those cases that it could apply, I think they're likely to be very protracted, very difficult cases where there's probably a criminal conviction case being built up, and the landlord at the same time has probably been trying to build up a case to recover the property. Because we generally think these would be very, very serious cases. The landlord will struggle in that situation, and it's often about witnesses being afraid to come forward. So if there is a conviction in those cases, it will help. You don't want to exaggerate about the amount of cases that will help in, but the cases in question are usually quite serious. It's true to say that the way that provision is worded, in theory, a landlord, if so motivated, could choose to evict somebody who's been convicted for a relatively minor offence which doesn't harm or distress other people. You know, a small possession of drugs case that didn't involve other people. So my feeling about that, or CIH's feeling about that, is that landlords are not interested in using it to evict that kind of person. Landlords are interested in this where it's been a long-running, very serious case that has harmed other people around and about, and harmed them in a very significant way and for a long time.
I think from Shelter Scotland's point of view, we can absolutely understand why landlords are seeking this change, and why MSPs may well support it. But we would urge a little bit of caution that a kind of, as David said, that being able to really assess what the nature of the offence is, and to take away sheriffs' ability to assess reasonableness in pursuing that eviction probably is a significant detrimental measure, and that we would argue very strongly that reasonableness should still be an option, and that should still be considered by a sheriff when considering an eviction under this power, particularly because that there may be certain types of offences, or there may be certain characteristics of the person whose eviction is being sought that may mean that it's not reasonable to evict them, and actually part of their reform, if you like, or part of the process of them changing their behaviour is to maintain a secure and stable home. So we would be certainly recommending that reasonableness is retained, and also potentially that tenants would have a right of appeal to these evictions.
I would point out that social landlords' record on evictions over the past 3 or 4 years has improved significantly. We're not in the business of evicting people. It just doesn't make any sense at all on any level. So obviously I disagree with Shelter on this. Reasonableness, I can understand that, but my understanding is that a sheriff would still have to consider proportionality, if not reasonableness, which is more of an issue, I think, in cases like this. But that might be worth checking out. Maybe we can come back to the committee on that.
I think the measure itself, as outlined in the bill, is welcome, but just flag up that we're only talking about a very small number here, and I think there's a wider discussion to be had about what actually can social housing providers do in the general context of some antisocial behaviour and criminality. I think that there's be a concern that everything seems to be falling at the door of the landlord, so where is the interface with the police, for example, and other services, I think is important. But although the measure is welcome, I think we would always see eviction as ultimately a failure. And the main issue, I think what we would like as landlords is just levers to try and make sure that people engage with us. Because I think if people engage properly with us, then a lot of these particular issues can be prevented. But there are extreme cases where, landlords have no alternative in their view but to try and seek recovery.
So, on the small number of cases where eviction has to take place, there's a comment that we received in the written submission from the Legal Services Agency that says the general view of solicitors commenting on the bill is that we have grave concerns concerning the balance of rights and powers adopted, particularly to those accused or guilty of antisocial conduct or behaviour. And they go on to say that all are entitled to somewhere to live and should not be pushed into a homeless underclass. Where are they to go? And I'm just wondering what your views are and whether the proposed power gets the rights between tenants and landlords correct.
I certainly would concur with that, and to the extent that that people convicted of a criminal act may, or received a conviction that will lead to a prison sentence, do still need somewhere to live. When that sentence ends. And there is a significant problem already in Scotland with homelessness from people coming out of prison. So I think we do need to consider the longer term implications of this. But clearly, that this is about getting that balance right between the impact that antisocial behaviour has on communities and on neighbours, and the rights of the individual and the tenant in these circumstances who may have perpetrated that antisocial behaviour. And it's a tricky situation that landlords are often in, but we want to make sure that the balance doesn't swing one way or the other, and that the right sort of, if I say come back to again, checks and balances are put in place to ensure and to ensure that the courts have some ability to make an assessment on an eviction case in these circumstances.
I mean, if you were discussing with a group of tenants who've been affected over a long period of time and had their lives blighted by serious and intimidatory antisocial behaviour, it's not really satisfactory to say to them, look, we could do something here, but we'll just be moving the problem somewhere else. That's not a satisfactory response to them.
And finally, David, you said earlier, and certainly in the CIHS written submission, that serious antisocial behaviour will always be very challenging to deal with, as in most cases these are few, if any, speedy remedies. What overall impact are the bill's proposals likely to have on the ability of social landlords to tackle antisocial behaviour, and does the bill help to tackle the causes of antisocial behaviour?
I'm not sure the bill seeks to tackle the causes of it. I think, as Alan has alluded to, we're talking about some wider issues here, which are about how people behave and how other agencies, not least the police, deal with that. I think overall the measures are welcome. It's some additional tools for landlords to deal with. But quite rightly, we live in a society where you're innocent until proven guilty, and it is exasperating for tenants to think that landlords can't suddenly remove an alleged perpetrator from their property. But of course that can't happen, and that's why we have strong tenancy rights, particularly in Scotland. But there are added measures. They will help landlords, but let's not, particularly in the publicity surrounding monitoring the bill as it goes through its stages, and then when it becomes an act, let's not over-egg to the public the extent to which this will help landlords solve every antisocial behaviour case quickly, because that probably isn't going to be the case.
And I think I'd also want to add, it's self-evident, but that antisocial behaviour is not a tenure-based issue, that antisocial behaviour occurs across all tenures of housing. We've talked already about the impact of right to buy in creating mixed communities, and you can see antisocial behaviour blighting communities where the landlord is a private landlord or an owner-occupier. So, you know, that what we're looking for is to give social landlords here proportionate powers and effective powers to deal with antisocial behaviour, but that it isn't a problem of housing, it is a problem of the way people behave in society, and that we need a strong response. We need obviously significant and appropriate powers to deal with it, but we also need to look at what support can be provided to individuals and to communities, and I think that's something that landlords should be looking at just as equally as what they might do to end tenancies in these situations.
I think landlords would see their relationship with agencies such as the police as being far more important, far more influential on dealing with antisocial behaviour than anything that's in this bill, to be honest.
Just reiterate, it's good that the bill may be providing some additional tools for landlords, but that the basis for that should always be to allow us to engage with people who are committing antisocial behaviour, and for other agencies to be able to support us in terms of trying to find a suitable remedy. Because there are, I mean, the written evidence that you've been given, we know of cases where tenancies have been recovered, and what happens is that the problem gets moved within the same area to the private rented sector. So, it would be much better if the behaviour could be tackled rather than the remedy to recover the housing. But from our perspective, I think that there's perhaps unrealistic expectations in what housing providers can do, and it needs the interface with other agencies as well and their full support. Because, as a housing association director, I hear all the time about the bun fight. It's a police problem, it's a housing problem, and there's not enough, I don't think, coordinated, joined up work that would try and deal with these kind of issues, without recourse or recovering the tenancy at the end of the day.
Okay, thanks very much.
Anyone else got any questions on that part? Okay, if we move on to part 3, which is the private rented housing. Jim, you've got some questions.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. Can I ask you first of all, in relation to the transfer of sheriff's jurisdiction, the bill makes provision to transfer certain types of civil court actions in relation to the private rented sector from the jurisdiction of the Sheriff Court to the jurisdiction of what will be a newly established first-tier tribunal. Can you tell us your views on that and whether you think that that will make a significant contribution to improving the quality of and access to justice for both landlords and tenants?
If I can start on this one, it's certainly something that we recommended and that we supported very strongly. We have seen a continual, over the last 10 years certainly, problem with access to justice for private tenants and indeed for landlords in the sector. And we think that the private rented sector is now housing a significant number of households across Scotland. It's double the number that it was 10 years ago. And then we also know that 26% of the tenants in the private rented sector are tenants with children, and increasingly the sector is becoming one that houses people for much longer periods of time. It's becoming less a transitional or a transitory tenancy. So there are big problems with private renting. There are big problems about conflict between landlords and tenants and unresolved issues, particularly around repairs. And we think that access to justice is a significant problem for tenants who might want to seek to improve the condition of their tenancy or challenge their landlord in certain circumstances. So we would certainly welcome the introduction of a private rented sector tribunal to try and overcome some of the problems that we've seen with the court system in the last little while.
I would echo everything Rosemary said. I would just add that all the advantages that a tribunal system would bring to the private rented sector about having a less adversarial, more user-friendly system would apply equally if a tribunal system were applied to the social sector. Although I realise that's a bigger issue, of course. But if you were going to come on to that,
we're coming straight on to that. I'd like to hear the views of the panel on the transfer of jurisdiction in relation to the private rented sector, first of all, please.
Yeah, I don't think I can add anything on to what Rosemary said, to be honest, but we certainly wanted to see some sort of pilot full housing tribunal that dealt with social cases too.
We would think it's a sensible measure.
Yeah, I think that does bring us seamlessly on to the next point, which is about extending the tribunal system to the social rented sector. The Chartered Institute for Housing have made the case that the transfer to the first tier tribunal should apply also to the social rented sector. Can you outline your reasons for that? And can you also tell us if you have costed that proposal and what you think the cost implications of such a move would be?
I mean, it's obviously a much greater move in terms of volume, cost, and we're not arguing at this stage that the bill be amended to take on board social sector cases, because we appreciate that there's a lot of work, a lot of costing work that would need to be done. What we're arguing for is on the basis that so many, well, it's very hard to find an advantage of the first tier tribunal that doesn't apply across the sectors, that the Scottish Government doesn't close off that option in the future. We are aware that there are some changes being made or will be made in the coming years to the Sheriff Court system, and we can understand or recognise that the Scottish Government would want to look to see what the impact of those changes is on the current Sheriff Court system, whether that does reduce delays, whether it can be made into a more user-friendly system. But we're simply asking that the option to apply tribunal system to the social sector isn't closed off forever.
Well, I don't disagree with anything that David has said. I would say that again that we supported the move to take private sector cases out of the Sheriff Court as the first stepping stone, if you like, particularly because there's such a degree of unmet need for dispute resolution within the private rented sector. Currently, tenants and landlords really avoid it as far as possible, and we see the consequences of that across the way that the private rented sector works at the moment. We know that repairs cases aren't dealt with as effectively as they might be because the access to the PRHP perhaps isn't as easy as it should be for tenants. And so one of the things that we would like to see I beg your pardon, the Private Rented Housing Panel, which is an existing tribunal for specifically dealing with repairs cases. One of the reasons for that is that tenants perhaps don't have the security of tenure that they might need in order to pursue those kinds of cases. So while we very much welcome the introduction of the tribunal for private rented sector cases, we think this should be accompanied by increased security of tenure for tenants to enable them to use these new powers, or so this new access to justice most effectively.
So I'm just want to be clear about what you mean by that. Are you saying that the scope of the tribunal should extend or not? No, sorry. Do you mean in terms of the social rented sector? Yes. Yes, I think that's certainly something to come on to and look to in the future, but I think in the first instance we think that the private rented sector cases should be the priority for that, and that it should be accompanied by an increase in security of tenure for tenants to enable them to use this access to justice most effectively. Right, thank you.
I mean, I wouldn't argue with anything. I particularly agree with what David said. We talked about access to justice earlier on, and one of the biggest complaints to me from our members is about swift access to justice, and the Sheriff Court system appears to be unfit for purpose in respect of social housing cases at the moment.
Andy just stole my thunder. I was just going to say the current system as it applies to the social rented sector isn't fit for purpose, and it actually penalises tenants as well, because I look at spreadsheets all the time and say rent arrears cases, and the legal fees are as high as the rent arrears because the length of time these processes take. So it is something that we feel has to be seriously looked at some point in the future. Since the Scottish Parliament, for example, was re-established, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about whether there should be a housing court, you know, to deal with some of these issues. It's, you know, the current sheriff court system is definitely not fit for purpose.
Ms Brocci, you mentioned the private rented housing panel, and the bill at section 23 to 25 makes provision to expand access to the panel by enabling third-party applications by local authorities to enforce the repairing standard, which of course is the condition standard and legal obligation that landlords have to meet in order to rent out their property. Presumably that is something that you agree with, but in answering that point, could you make reference to the earlier comments you made about the bill perhaps being in need of strengthening in relation to safety and electrical safety?
Certainly. Yes, we do support the proposal for third-party reporting. I think if we look at the volume of cases that are taken to the private rented housing panel by tenants challenging their landlord over the basic condition of their property, it's minuscule in comparison with what we know is a very significant disrepair across the private rented sector. Shelter sees cases every day, and it's one of the most significant things that people call us about is about problems with their private rented property, problems of disrepair and of damp, and sometimes very severe and very significant problems. And tenants in this situation often do not want to challenge their landlord because they fear a retaliatory eviction. They will not go through the process of taking the landlord to a tribunal when they only have a 6-month short assured tenancy, and in some cases will only have a month's notice if that secure period is finished. So we do think it's important that in order to deal with disrepair in the private rented sector, that local authorities have these powers to take action against private landlords in these circumstances. However, we would want to ensure that that it isn't implemented in a way that creates any kind of conflict between the landlord and the tenant and inadvertently leads to the ending of that tenancy. However, that is a much bigger problem, as I've alluded to, and security of tenure for private tenants is, at the moment, just not good enough to allow the sector to improve and to allow for it to continue meeting housing need in the way that it is. So clearly, we would welcome the introduction of third-party reporting, but we also need to consider what happens to tenants in those circumstances and if they're forced to move on from the tenancy. You mentioned that we would also be seeking the committee to consider the introduction of stronger regulation around electrical safety particularly, and carbon monoxide safety within privately rented homes. It's one of the things that we would like to see this bill strengthened with. I think provisions potentially will be considered to increase electrical safety standards in the private rented sector, but we would also like to see the committee look at the possibility of making carbon monoxide monitors or alarms mandatory for all private tenants.
Okay, that's helpful. I just want to understand where the gap in the legislation that's currently drafted actually is, so that it can be addressed. So that the private rented housing panel can issue repairing standard enforcement orders to ensure that landlords bring properties up to the appropriate standard, which, as I've said, is a legal obligation. Isn't that the mechanism for ensuring that we meet the additional safety and electrical standards that you've mentioned?
Absolutely. It's the mechanism for achieving that, but what we're looking for is additions to the repairing standards, potentially to cover specifically electrical safety and carbon monoxide alarms to prevent unneeded and unnecessary deaths in Scotland.
Achieved through an amendment to the legislation? Certainly,
yes, it could.
So we'll look forward to that.
Okay.
Okay, can I ask panel members if they've got anything to add on that specific point?
The comment that the repairing standard itself is very basic, and I think we would concur that that's something that needs to be strengthened in the private rented sector, we would say. You can just draw the parallels with the social rented sector, where we're complying with the Scottish Housing Quality Standard, for example, and there's a whole system of regulation in place, which is absolutely fine, but there's nothing equivalent in the private rented sector. And I do think it's something that urgently needs addressed. In terms of Scottish housing in general, if there's any crisis in terms of quality of accommodation, it lies in the private sector, not in the social rented sector.
I'll just add a couple of comments. CIH Scotland has certainly been, along with a number of other housing bodies, working closely with the Electrical Safety Council in the last couple of years to try and to try and get better electrical safety standards reflected in the repairing standards, and that would include the requirement for regular safety checks by a qualified person. Now, we realise that provision hasn't as such been consulted upon, and that does create some issues for the Scottish Government, but it's an issue we'd very much like to keep in for the Scottish Government and for the Parliament to keep in mind. If it were not to be possible in the current bill, then that it be considered at the earliest possible opportunity thereafter. Just finally, a comment on the very welcome measure on third-party reporting to the private rented housing panel. In the unfortunate circumstance that a tenant does move on, and obviously I would echo what Rosemary said about hoping that this doesn't lead to that, but where a tenant has moved on, whether because they've had difficulty or they just happen to have moved on, but the local authority still wants to pursue action, this power will enable it to do that, and that doesn't exist at the moment. So that's really welcome. The tenant moving on doesn't stop now the local authority pursuing the landlord.
Could I add something? We mentioned just now the difference between the repair in the private rented sector and in the social sector, and I think I would agree with most of those points. However, we are also seeking a strengthening of the rights for tenants placed in temporary accommodation to have access to good quality accommodation and good standards. And specifically, again, that would be a very simple amendment to an existing regulation that provides for unsuitable accommodation for certain categories of tenants placed in temporary accommodation. That should be also extended to cover the condition of that property that they're placed in.
I did receive a petition from Shelter Scotland just before Christmas on that very issue, so I'm aware of the issue and looking forward to some further discussions on that. Can I just ask you, the panel, finally, do you have an opinion on the Scottish Government's view as outlined in the policy memorandum at paragraph 131 that, and I quote, proposals for court reform and increased use of mediation will provide the opportunity to improve outcomes for social sector cases while they remain with the courts?
I think that's a reference to some of the reforms of the civil court system that are taking place, and I think the jury's out. Excuse the pun, but the jury's out on that in terms of quite what impact some of these changes will make. I think CIH has always been a supporter, and I'm sure every organisation represented here today is a supporter of mediation where that's appropriate. There are, of course, cases where mediation may be particularly difficult. You know, the whole idea of mediation is that people volunteer for that rather than are coerced into it. So it's not going to be appropriate for every case. But yes, if further use of mediation and further reform of the reform of the court system can help the social sector, but we have to wait and see what the impact of these changes is.
Mediation is a very useful tool, no doubt about that. It's a well-used tool as well, actually, in the social sector. Access to mediation is a bit of an issue, I think, at the moment. It's quite patchy, as far as I understand, across Scotland. So that's maybe something to look at.
This is the sector, the part that you're interested in. Patrick, have you got any questions?
Thank you, Convener. I'm sure I'm by no means alone amongst members seeing an increase in the volume of issues raised with me in relation to the private rented sector, so I appreciate the opportunity to contribute to the committee's discussions. There's been a general welcome, I think, for the measures which are included in the bill in relation to the private rented sector. I'd like to ask whether there are views on the panel about areas where the bill could have gone a little further. Rosemary Brocci mentioned security of tenure, and the bill could have addressed that. We know, however, that the government is undertaking some further work, and there could be moves further down the line after this bill. But in the issues that have been raised with me by constituents, it seems to me that the vulnerability that insecure tenure creates is most damaging when it relates to other issues as well. That might be a small minority where you're talking about illegal evictions, harassment, aggressive or threatening behaviour by landlords, or much more common instances of minor repairs, the kind of thing that will never realistically go to a panel or a tribunal. People just put up with it, minor repairs not being done. It could be in relation to the proliferation, the increasingly common proliferation of alternative ways of getting around the tenancy deposit scheme, failure to comply with that, or using so-called advance rent to replace deposits in all but name, or discrimination against housing benefit claimants in the private rented sector. Could the panel give an indication of whether they'd like to see additional measures or further progress from government in this bill or in policy at the same time?
Answer that. I'm a member of the review group that you've mentioned there, that's looking at government review group, looking at the way that the private rented sector tenancy operates currently. And I think that the consideration of that group so far has identified a very significant range of problems with the way that the tenancy works, both for landlords and for tenants. And I think one of the conclusions that we're coming to is that obviously I don't speak for the group, but certainly from my point of view, that the tenancy regime is working currently very informally. We actually don't see, on the vast majority of cases, actual tenancies set up correctly. We don't see the protections, I suppose, that should be there, both for landlords and for tenants, properly enforced. And in fact, because we don't see that landlords or tenants choose to use the court system because of all the reasons we've just mentioned, that actually most often tenancies are ended with a kind of a no-fault ground at the end of the period, and that tenants themselves do not want to pursue their landlord or pursue changes to their property or to improvements, but they'd rather just move on. And what we see there is a very fluid and a very kind of transitory sector, and it doesn't need to be that. Quite clearly, a lot of people rent from private landlords and rent in that sector because they want the flexibility to stay for a few months and then move into owner occupation or move on. They want to try out an area, if you like, sometimes. We don't want to see the end of that. That's absolutely not the case. Security of tenure doesn't necessarily mean we would be almost recreating a longer term sector. But what we also want to see is, or what we do want to see is security of tenure there, so that when tenants are facing problems, they can challenge their landlord. If they want to do that, they can turn to a local authority to help them if appropriate. But actually try and almost rebalance the power to some extent between landlords and tenants in these situations.
And some of the other issues that I mentioned, for example, failure to comply with the tenancy deposit scheme, we know that the government isn't able to put a figure on how much compliance is taking place, but I'm sure Shelter will be aware of many people who've found that landlords or letting agents are working their way around those provisions by claiming not to be charging a deposit, but in fact charging a deposit in all but name. Other provisions that we could be looking at in this bill which would improve the operation of systems that are already in place, but which clearly aren't working as intended.
Yes, and I think certainly with that issue, the onus is on the tenant to take the landlord to court over non-protection of their deposit. The penalty for doing that, and for the penalty for the landlord, is that 3 times the deposit, or up to 3 times the deposit. So there's clearly almost an incentive there for tenants to do that, and yet we're not seeing many of them take that action. If that's one of the things that's moved into the tribunal, that would be very welcome. But yes, we'd be very interested in considering other options for addressing this problem. And
finally, Convener, if I may, do you have concerns about the issue of discrimination in the private rented sector against housing benefit claimants, either now or how that may increase with housing benefit changes coming through? Is there anything that we could be doing in Scotland to address that issue?
Yes, like you, I'm sure everybody around the table here has heard of cases over the last few months where landlords are whole-scale deciding not to let to people in receipt of housing benefit. This isn't a new problem, it's one we've seen many times in the past, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with those adverts that says no DSS. We are concerned about the availability of private rented accommodation at the levels of affordability that people on housing benefits can afford, and there is going to be continuing uncertainty as we move towards the introduction of universal credit amongst landlords who perhaps aren't prepared to take the risks. So certainly we are concerned about this and would welcome measures to try and address that.
Can I just add on that point? CIH Scotland and CIH indeed across the UK would equally be concerned, or is concerned, at reports of private landlords, in a sense, pulling out of housing people who are in receipt of housing benefit. It's very hard to see how any government can legislate to tell people who to house and who not to. So I guess certainly one obvious reaction from us would be that if further people are going to be excluded from the private rented sector who might have turned to that in the past, then it just raises the importance of an improved supply of social sector houses. The current target is 4,000 a year. I know times are difficult, but the more we can do to increase that target, then the more we give people an option who now may not have the private rented sector to turn to.
Okay, thanks. We've touched on the letting agents, and clearly there's already been legislation regarding letting agents. Do you agree that regulation of letting agents is required, and if so, why?
Yes, we wholeheartedly agree that regulation of letting agents is necessary, and I actually don't know of anybody who doesn't. In fact, even the sector itself is calling for regulation. We do see a disproportionate number of calls to our helpline from tenants who are having problems with their letting agent. And as you may know, we have been running a campaign over the last little while around charging of unlawful fees by letting agents to tenants. But this isn't the only problem that we see. And in fact, there are quite a wide range of management practices that some letting agents, I should say, are engaged in, which are really counterproductive to ensuring a secure and stable private sector experience for many tenants. So just as we would like to see regulation come in, we also want to make sure, obviously, that it is effective, and particularly that it has sufficient powers to enforce change in the sector. It's all very well having, as we've seen with landlord registration, a list, if you like, but we need to make sure that any regulation also has teeth and can enforce change amongst agents in practice.
So how would you propose that regulatory regime would work in practice?
Well, the proposal in the bill is that the Scottish Government sets up a register of letting agents, and that the register, to be accepted onto that, you have to accept a code of practice and pass a fit and proper person test. I think that the nature of that code of practice and the dispute resolution that surrounds it needs to be looked at very carefully to make sure that is going to be effective.
So do you think it needs to be beefed up in some way over and above what's in the bill? Or? Well,
we don't know the detail, obviously, of what would be in the code of practice. That's for secondary legislation. We'd be very interested to see what that's going to cover. But the dispute resolution, again, I think the bill introduces powers rather than sets out in detail how it's going to operate. I think certainly we'd be looking for, encouraging the committee to look for assurances from the government about how it will operate in practice.
And would you expect to be consulted on that? Yes.
Yes, certainly at any later stage.
Anyone else got any? No. Okay, the next part is part 5, mobile home sites with permanent residents. Does anyone have any comments on that part of the bill? Perhaps only Shelter, I don't know.
No, not in detail, I'm afraid, Convener. I think we acknowledge that this area is one that's needing reform, and I'm glad that the government's acting on it. But I don't have any details. Any comments on the detail of the legislation.
Does Shelter get calls from people on mobile home sites?
Occasionally, it's not a big concern. Certainly in this area of park homes, we are, that there is a problem in areas of rural Scotland of people living in caravans, if you like, in unlicensed sites, but that's not what this legislation is covering.
No. Okay, and part 6 is private housing conditions. We've touched a bit on this already, particularly in relation to the ability of local authorities to pay a missing share and recoup that from the private part of a block, usually. Do you have any views on the provisions relating to this?
I would simply say they appear to be very, very welcome clarifications or modest amendments to the existing powers. Probably the broader issue here is not so much a legislative one, but a question of what resources hard-pressed local authorities are able to use to exercise these powers, because usually it involves money, and that obviously presents challenges for local authorities at any time, but particularly at the current time. But that's not something that obviously the legislation can tackle.
Yeah, we'll certainly ask that when we have the local authority representatives in. And in general, do you have any comments about the bill's miscellaneous provisions, or are there any other issues that you would want to raise regarding the bill, now that you've got the chance?
I think one area that just hasn't come up and been covered is one where we would like to see additional power that's not in the bill currently, and that's under what's termed the Section 5 referral process, which is the process that a local authority making referrals to a housing association to house people under their homelessness duties has. Currently, there is mixed practice across Scotland as to whether a Section 5 referral process is used or whether it's a more informal nomination process. We think there are very strong arguments, and this is something we've raised with committee before in previous legislation, very strong arguments for making it kind of mandatory across the board that landlords use, that local authorities use a Section 5 process to secure housing from social landlords. We think that it would increase transparency. It would enable landlords local authorities to see where their RSLs in their area are providing more help needs, and it would also enable tenants to be able to understand the reason why perhaps they were refused, and that currently isn't the case where these are being used more informally.
If I may, do you want? Rosemary's right that there are a variety of different mechanisms that local authorities across Scotland use to work with registered social landlords to house homeless people, and sometimes that's Section 5, and sometimes it's a different kind of, as Rosemary said, more informal arrangement. It strikes CIH that a local authority which is dissatisfied with the way in which RSLs are or aren't contributing to helping it achieve its homelessness objectives, can actually start using Section 5 if it feels that that's necessary. If informal arrangements, nominations arrangements, are not working well, then the local authority now can choose to move to using Section 5. So it feels a bit like that what Shelter's asking about is perhaps mending something that doesn't really seem to be broken, if in the local authority's view they're happy with the way things are working.
Yeah, it seems to go away from the kind of person-centred approach that we've moved on to now. It doesn't sit comfortably with me at all. It almost seems to be a case of Shelter want to introduce this to kind of monitor what RSLs are doing rather than worry about the outcome for the homeless person, which has got to be first and foremost in everybody's thoughts. If a different mechanism to Section 5 works best for the applicants, surely it would be ludicrous to change it.
I think what we're clear about at the moment, and we're not clear about, is that it is working best for the applicants. And as I said, there are some areas where RSLs are playing a very large role in housing homeless people, and other areas where they're not. I think, in answer to David's point, the Section 5 process, I think, is sometimes seen as almost being the bit of the big stick in this allocations process. It doesn't need to be that, and it shouldn't be that. It's not a complicated, it's not an overly burdensome process. But what it does do is increase transparency and make it measurable, so we are actually able to see the contribution. And I think also should be able to help partnership working. And I think in answer to Andy's point, we are not suggesting that those informal, what's called a nomination arrangement, where it may be a personal even contact between somebody in the local authority and somebody in the housing association facilitates that house becoming available. But what we would want to see is that that's also then backed up with the process of a Section 5. So these two things don't have to be at either end of a spectrum. They can work hand in hand, and we think that it would actually improve the situation for many homeless people across Scotland.
Okay. Anyone else got any questions? Right, can I thank you all very much for your input to this? It's been most helpful. And can I suspend the meeting briefly for the witnesses to change over? we can continue with the first item of business, we move on to the second panel of witnesses on the Housing Bill. And I welcome Paul Brown, Chief Executive Officer of the Legal Services Agency, Michael Clancy, Director of Law Reform and the Law Society, and Gary Burns, Prevention of Homelessness Caseworker at the Govan Law Centre. Adam, would you like to start off on this session, please?
Thanks, Convener. Morning, gentlemen. The Scottish Government has a vision for housing that, and if I quote, that all people in Scotland live in high-quality, sustainable homes that they can afford and that meet their needs. To what extent do you think this bill's provisions support that vision?
Who would like to start? Michael?
Thank you, Convener. I'm probably the least qualified on the panel to be able to answer Adam Ingram's question, but, well, of course, it's important to have a vision in housing provision. The Law Society, as you'll see from our paper, doesn't comment on the policy behind the government's views here, but solicitors buy and sell houses for people all over the country. And we try to do our bit in helping to make that provision a reality for people. Beyond that, I'm not really sure that I would be qualified to comment on government policy in that kind of context.
Paul.
I think absolutely buy into the vision, and I think the efforts to deal with some issues by way of the abolition of the right to buy and the tackling of tenemental repairs are both important initiatives. We, however, and I think my colleague here concurs, that there is a major problem with homelessness, and in some respects, I'm afraid, I think that some of the provisions of the bill will make that worse. The problem of homelessness is, from our particular legal services agency's experience, between 12th of April 2012 and 11th of April 2013, we advised 256 rough sleepers in Glasgow. That has soared, however, 12th of April 2013 till the 11th of December 2013, obviously much less than a year, it was 355 rough sleepers. We think that that number will double this year from a baseline 4 or 5 years ago of very few rough sleepers. So there is a major problem, and we are concerned that some of the approaches to managing antisocial behaviour and to, in general, and allocations policies will make the position more difficult, particularly in Glasgow, because we understand from Glasgow City Council press releases that one of the reasons why they have this problem is the difficulty in getting housing through registered social landlords. And we are concerned that an implicit strategy behind the bill appears to be that people who are accused of, and obviously sometimes guilty of, antisocial behaviour are going to be thrown onto the tender mercies of the private sector. So it seems to be a bit the opposite of what one would expect. The private sector has none of the resources to deal with people with problems, mental health problems or what's behaviour problems, but the policy seems to be to exclude them more from RSLs and local authority stock. We are concerned about that.
Sorry, Anna, can I come in? Is this what you describe not a position particularly relating to Glasgow? Because we've seen overall in Scotland the number of applications for homelessness assistance fall by about 13% compared to the previous year. So I'm getting the feeling, you know, in relation to articles in the newspapers and things, that this is a passing the buck situation, particularly relating to Glasgow, because they don't have, Glasgow City Council don't have their own housing stock. And you know, certainly when we took evidence in relation to our homelessness inquiry and met with the GHA and another organisation in Glasgow in particular, because we went there to take evidence, that they were very proud of the work that they had done in Glasgow, and now we seem to be finding that Glasgow City Council are reneging on their obligations to the homeless?
Well, Glasgow City Council say that they can't get the housing from RSLs. I mean, I'm not privy to that. We heard in the earlier session about Section 5 referrals by the local authority to registered social landlords, but that is basically, there's not very much compulsion on RSLs. They can turn down a referral if there's a good reason for them to do so. So you have this lack of alignment between a local authority's obligations and ability to provide housing. If there's a stock transfer situation, the people who have the housing don't really have the obligation, but the local authority does. And that is a mismatch. I would suggest that allocation policy for all public sector organisations, including RSLs, should be aligned with the public policy to provide accommodation for people who are homeless. The two things need to be aligned together. Otherwise, you're going to have this mismatch just keeping on. Wonderful law. I mean, the homelessness law has improved enormously. No question about that. And it's something we can all rightly be proud of. But there has to be a means to implement it, and it appears there isn't. Glasgow City Council's announced that I don't know where they got the money from, but it's great. They're going to be providing 60 new beds for temporary accommodation. But in terms of the numbers concerned, that would appear to that doesn't look to me as though it's going to get them very far. There needs to be a change in the way housing is allocated to give more priority to people who are vulnerable owing to homelessness, and a proportion of them will inevitably be people who have had behaviour problems in the past. And we can't have a situation where there is nowhere for them to go. I appreciate that people who behave in an antisocial manner need to be controlled, but that can't be in a way that results in them simply becoming a homeless underclass. I mean, one sort of suspects that the fantasy people have is, they'll go off to London or something. I mean, but the point is that they're not going to go away. They're here to stay, and we need to have a joined-up policy.
My point was that it seems to be a particular Glasgow situation where in the rest of the country, as far as we can ascertain from the dealings that we have with our local authorities and our housing associations, they work together. The letting is done on a cross-social housing basis. And because, as I said, Glasgow doesn't have its own City Council doesn't have its own housing stock, there seems to be a particular problem there. But I think we should move on.
Yes, well, maybe I could ask Gary to pick up on that, given his experience. And if I could just add a little bit to that, obviously one of the outcomes that the Scottish Government is looking for here is to try to encourage sustainable communities, if you like. That's one of the outcomes they're seeking from this legislation. So could you talk to that in response to what you've heard already, Gary?
Okay. I'd just like to mirror what Paul has said, and I agree that Glasgow is a specific case in Scotland and has the worst homelessness in Scotland. However, the figures don't always tell the true story, and hidden homelessness isn't only happening in Glasgow, it's happening in every community. And I've worked with enough local authorities in this job and my previous job in homelessness to know that there are significant barriers to everybody who presents to a local authority, and that's something that has to be investigated. Sometimes local authorities do everything they can before they'll take them on as an actual homelessness case, and I dealt with something like that just end of last week, going into this week, and I won't name the local authority, but they'd done everything they could rather than take them on as a homelessness client. And it was a couple, and the young person was 16 years old, and the local authority were bashing them back and forward to each other. So this idea that it's only in Glasgow, I don't think is completely true. But to go back to the original point and to kind of maybe open it up a wee bit, I think that to have these sustainable communities is that something has to be done about private landlords. We work with private landlords. It's probably about 30% of my caseload, and you have private landlords that are charging, very, very high rents. There's more and more people coming to my organisation saying, I can't afford my rent. What am I supposed to do? And there isn't really a solution that we can offer to that, because they can't present as a homelessness family because technically they have a tenancy, and we're quite reluctant to tell them to rank up rent arrears because then they're going to have this big debt and they'll have to go through an eviction process. So this unaffordable private rent is a significant problem, and there is a very simple solution to that, and that's with the Scottish Government doing something about rents in the private sector. Also, with regards to tenancies in private sector not being fit for purpose.
Stop here, because I think we're getting into detail that we might come to when we look particularly at the private rented sector. So we're just sort of looking at a broad brush at the moment. You'll certainly be able to come back to the detail of that.
Okay. So in general terms, you're saying that we need to do more than what is in this legislation to create the kind of sustainable communities that we're looking for, essentially. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. The final question I've got is just in terms of the consultation process for this bill. Are you content with that? Were there some areas where there were deficiencies? What's your views on that, please?
Like, I'll look at the consultation process. We got quite a lot of stuff quite late on, so it's been difficult for us to get an excellent look at it. But I think there's a lot of tenants' voices missing, and there's talks about changing things to do with the age in terms of reasonable preference. I don't see any young people having been consulted or any young persons' organisations being consulted, because if you're in certain thing to do with age, my experience will be that won't be to the detriment of anybody apart from young people. And if you're changing the process, I think young people's organisations like Bernardo's, Save the Children, they've got homelessness or like kind of places all over Scotland. I think their voice would be very positive and informing the debate, and that part of the consultation actually says you didn't consult on it. So, you know, if you've got your own consultation paper saying that you've not consulted, I think maybe that part definitely has to. I'd also like to see more tenants' voices in terms of the process. To me, I think a lot of this policy looks like it's been written for and on behalf of the registered social landlords without taking account of tenants' voices.
Panel suggested that there were tenants representatives here who suggested that they had been quite pleased actually with the consultations that they've had. But I take your point about some of these things coming late on the scene.
Excluded from getting into tenancies from this haven't been consulted, so you know it's easy for a tenant to sit and say, no, that's a good idea, because it means I'm not getting somebody who's had an ASBO or been evicted next to me. But they people also deserve housing, and I think that only listening to select fewer tenants, I think it should be a wider debate for people who are living chaotic lifestyles, because we can get access into speaking to them. There's enough organisations working with them and asking them how, you know, if they're going through homelessness or into different tenancies and in and out of places, ask them what they think could keep them sustained and what would help them sustain a tenancy, as opposed to telling them how to not get housing.
Yes, I entirely agree with what my colleague said. I would suggest that the RHAG, the Affordable Rented Housing Advisory Group, its membership should have been markedly wider. There are no organisations represented on it that specifically represent homeless people, lawyers that represent homeless people, shelters represented, but it bore the full weight of representing that constituency. There's no organisations representing people with mental health problems, and you know, that is one of the areas that we are sort of talking about when you're talking about some aspects of antisocial behaviour. So I would have said it should have been broader, and I would entirely agree that young people don't have a voice in established tenants' organisations or housing associations in general, so an effort needs to be made there.
Well, I think the general point about consultation is that it can always be done better, and the Standards and Procedures Committee is currently looking at the legislative process, and I think that it will probably receive comments on the issue of consultation. I think that is something which we've got to look at in the round And I think particularly taking up the point which Gary has made about reaching those constituencies that are not within the so-called usual suspects, in inverted commas, I think that's a challenge to Parliament, and it's a challenge to government to be able to do that, and using social media much more, thinking out of the box. If the box is a committee room, to go out into the community. These are issues about getting to those who are affected by legislation, and being a long-time consultee and a long-time responder to consultation. It is no doubt easier for organisations that have dedicated staff and resources to do it than individuals or under-resourced organisations. These are just general comments, actually. On the point.
It's helpful, thank you. Moving on to the detail of the bill, part 1's about the abolition of the right to buy. Do you have any comments to make about the proposed abolition of the right to buy, particularly in relation to the impact on tenants' rights?
I think it's me again. Well, having listened to some of the earlier questioning, and also having read last week's official report, I've seen that there's been a concern around the committee about, or questions raised, to be more accurate, about whether this is compliant with ECHR. And if one takes a look at the provisions of the Convention which engage with property rights, such as Article 8, where everyone has a right to respect for private and family life, home and correspondence, and Protocol 1, which deals with the peaceful enjoyment of possessions. I think as one looks at that, you can see exactly how the conclusion could be reached that these provisions abolishing the right to buy are compliant with the Convention and Protocol 1. There was a case called Chapman v. the UK in 2001, 33 EHRR 399, which effectively says that Article 8 does not give the right to be provided with a house. And I have tried to track down a 2004 case relating to Northern Ireland, which spoke of the right to buy there not being something which engaged Article 1 of Protocol 1, where every natural or legal person is entitled to the peaceful enjoyment of his possessions. No one shall be deprived of his possessions except in the public interest and subject to the provisions provided for by law and by the general principles of international law. When you stack those up, this is being done by law. It's being done in accordance with what is considered to be the public interest. And I think although that the abolition and the way it is being done would not prevent someone from taking a case that their human rights have been contravened, I think I would agree with the comment made last week by the government official that it's unlikely that that would be successful.
Do you have a view on the length of time for this process to extinguish the right, if you like, has been stipulated at 3 years? We've heard from others that perhaps 1 year would be sufficient. Do you have a view on that?
It's a personal view only. I didn't consult anyone back at the office on this, but I think that 3 years is quite reasonable. It gives people a reasonable time in which to make a decision as to whether or not they are going to exercise the right to buy, so there. That would be my view.
Okay. Other gentlemen, have you got views on this matter?
We support the.
We do as well. It's a bold and important reform.
Okay, if we move on to part 2 then, social housing. Mark, you've got the first question on this.
have any comments to make regarding the bill's provisions that are aimed at increasing flexibility social landlords have around allocating properties, particularly around the changes to the reasonable preference and the inclusion of age as a factor that they're able to take into account?
My view, and I've already said, just to summarise, is that I think RSL's obligations in allocation of housing need to be aligned with local authorities' obligations to provide housing, particularly where there's been a stock transfer situation. So I have no difficulty with increasing flexibility, but within the context that the flexibility needs to be constrained by enabling the local authority to meet its obligations to people who are homeless. And what I would be concerned about is that the increased flexibility may well make that more difficult, and also gives a message, if you see what I mean, rather than necessarily what's in law, gives a message that public policy is that RSLs should be able to decide their own priorities without regard to the needs of the wider community. So that would be my concern. I entirely accept that old Section 20 was out of date and to some extent not terribly helpful, saying reasonable preference, because it doesn't really mean all that much. I would be in favour of something much clearer and much more specific, requiring RSLs basically to have their policy aligned with the needs of allocation to homeless people, along with other issues. Of course, it's not an easy issue, but it needs to be highlighted.
I think one danger we've seen with this is when removing overcrowding. When it comes to the reasonable preference, we'd be concerned for that to be removed, because overcrowding is certainly an issue in Glasgow and I guess in other kind of local authorities, and removing that as a reasonable preference I don't think would be a great idea. And just to go back to the age, although I've already touched on it, I think that young people are having significant changes to housing benefit that have already happened and are going to happen. But to start kind of taking away their right to social housing at a time when their rights have been eroded significantly, I don't think is the best move. I think actually that young people should have exclusive rights within housing, because some young people can't stay at home, some young people don't have great families, and I think that there is some help from social work and there is some policy. I think that by consulting in other organisations we can figure out a way of getting young people into decent housing, because if they can get into decent housing they can then get into college or they can go to work, and it would be I think it would be a good idea for the Scottish Government to do that. And I guess that when it comes to the tolerable standard, I think there has to be some definition. I think there's quite a lot in this policy that says, you know, that the Scottish Government's going to come back and define this term. The way it looks to me, I don't think removing tolerable standard would be a good idea either, because it means that people are living in accommodation that isn't tolerable, and if they can't move because of that, I don't see how else they can. And I guess that the problem would be is that RSLs are set up to help housing. If the tolerable standard becomes so bad, then they would then go to statutory homeless, which then creates more problems and more money. They would then be put into a social housing anyway. So to me, to remove that as a way of social housing taking on a new tenant, I think would be a bad idea.
So, Mary, do you want to go on to the antisocial behaviour?
Convener, I wanted to ask some questions around the Scottish secure tenancies. The bill has provisions which would widen the circumstances in which landlords can use short SSTs where there's a history of antisocial behaviour. And I'd be interested in the panel's views on whether those proposals are both appropriate and proportionate, and if the panel have any concerns about the type of evidence that a social landlord would need to have to make use of those powers.
We have considerable concerns about the overall direction of travel about antisocial behaviour in the bill. Starting off with the allocation provisions, if one likes, is that there is a codification of the means whereby allocation of housing will be delayed for a minimum period set by the landlord if one is held to be guilty of antisocial behaviour. There is no real way of protesting about that in terms of the bill. A summary application is no more than an Article 6 fig leaf, because the number of people who will have the easy access to legal advice and representation to submit an article, a summary application will be, I would imagine, no more than one a year. I don't know how many. I have never been consulted by anybody in that type of area. So the point is that you've got a group of people who will not, in some areas, be able to be allocated any social housing for a minimum period of time. We don't know what minimum time, and their access to any way of disputing that will be limited. They then may be able to apply for a, maybe allocated a house if somebody else, or maybe they didn't go through that route, but they allocated a house and then antisocial behaviour is committed or alleged to be committed. The demotion process is very vague. Previously, if one already had a secure tenancy, the demotion to SST was subject to a case having gone through a criminal court. I mean, very clear. But the new demotion process is much vaguer, and there isn't a, whilst we entirely approve of the idea that people will get reasons for it and so forth, there isn't, again, an easy way of protesting about that. Again, it's another summary application. We seem to be having a summary application fest here. But anyway, that won't cash out in real terms in applications to the court, because it just won't happen. So somebody will may be accused of antisocial behaviour without that having gone through any sort of court process, demoted to a SST, and then that SST brought to an end, and again there's a summary application process, I think, but full judicial process to evict the person isn't easily available. So I'm concerned about the potential for misuse and the difficulty that people who have chaotic lives or mental health problems or whatever it may be will have in actually getting an opportunity to have an outside court, and that's the forum that society provides, getting a court to actually look at that. So I'm concerned about that. I would prefer that either the demotion was made more restricted, back to the old criteria, or if the new criteria are going to be left in, that there be be a requirement for the landlord to raise a summary cause action, so that the landlord has to get it into court rather than the tenant. It's getting into the court. We no doubt will discuss later whether court or tribunal, but I'm not really too bothered about that particular question. The point is to have another bite at the cherry, an opportunity to go to a court and get the forms of advice, assistance and representation that are provided through that route, which is much easier currently than to take the initiative to make a summary application.
Yeah, I think that the designing a solution for a problem that doesn't exist, because the SSTs can be used at the moment anyway, and if there has been antisocial behaviour, we feel that with families or individuals that there is antisocial behaviour in place. There's other issues, there's other things going on, there's maybe some mental health problems, sorry, excuse me, maybe some addiction issues, maybe both, or there could be other things that are going on in the family, and you know, tenants don't want to lose their homes. Tenants don't want to lose their homes. Yes, there can be some tenants that are acting in a way that's no great for everybody else, but we feel that, you know, you work with a tenant like that instead of threatening, which is what we feel this is going to be saying. And although you've got to keep an eye on the wider community, I think that when you're talking about people with issues, you've got to be concerned about that if you are just going to start making it easier to get somebody like them out, where are they going to go? right, once you've put them out of a social housing, where do they go? They're going to go to the council for accommodation, and the council is then obliged to accommodate them in temporary accommodation, which costs a lot of money, and then they may well end up in a private flat. If they've got issues, the issues don't disappear when they move into a private flat. Whatever issues they had that created the ASBO goes with them into their new tenancy, wherever they go. So we would feel that, yeah, I think ASBOs as a tool as they're used just now are sufficient, but if you're talking about people with behaviour that's needing to be changed for the wider community, why not have something in the policy where there's a statutory obligation for the local authority to put in support services? Because just now, most councils, they won't put in tenancy support unless there's homelessness. So, you know, if we're helping folk that are in homelessness, why not help folk that are struggling in tenancies and just keep the triple STs as they are just now?
Any?
I'm afraid I wouldn't. No.
Okay. So, did the panel then think that if there was some quite specific guidance issued by the government on to landlords on how this should be used, would that be helpful?
And I think the procedure and the rights need to be tightened up. I don't think it's a matter just of guidance. There will be human rights challenges. As the way it's drafted, yes, I would. I mean, for instance, the amendment to the demotion, the new demotion criteria, which is how the accused, the defender, or the tenant, or members of the family, or visitors, or whatever, have acted within a period of 3 years. And the landlord may have records on how somebody is accused of having done something 2.5 years ago. Most people won't have any records. Getting evidence about that sort of thing will be a very complex matter. So, and then if one wants to test the facts, it's by way of summary application. But there isn't a test of reasonableness. I mean, when the court looks at this, they're not told you have to look at reasonableness. And in the 2001 Act, reasonableness is defined in various ways if one's evicting somebody from a secure tenancy. I would suggest that in order to be human rights compliant, you probably need to have a test of reasonableness for most of these sorts of disputed issues. The test of reasonableness can be explained in more detail in statute or by guidance. But if one doesn't put that in, people will try proportionality challenges, which isn't quite the same thing. But if landlords want certainty and clarity, rather than leaving it to proportionality, it's much better to say the decision-making needs to be reasonable. And if the antisocial behaviour, the course of conduct, for instance, in the demotion situation, okay, not proven by way of a criminal court through an ASBO or whatever, but if the course of conduct's been so bad that it's obviously reasonable, their lawyer will tell them that the eviction or the demotion is perfectly reasonable, and if they don't go along with that, they're going to get evicted, and they won't get legal aid either. And the sheriff will be very annoyed if a defence is attempted, which is obviously absurd. The point that one has to trust the process to some extent, rather than leave it to good practice on the part of landlords. Good practice among landlords, I think, is probably general, but there are mistakes made and there are prejudices, and sometimes witnesses are prejudiced. So these things do need to be properly tested, and I don't think the way it's dealt with in the proposals provides for that fully.
Gary, do you have any further comments?
No. Anything that Paul's not already said.
No. Okay. And there are also proposals in the bill which would provide further protection for tenants, particularly those with the short SSTs. Do you think any other type of protection is required? I mean, I know you've talked at length about issues that you have with it, but is there something specific that could be added in that would help?
To protect
tenants?
Well, I mean, I'm concerned about the new proposed recovery of possession procedure for secure tenants, which in section 15 removes reasonableness from the test for antisocial behaviour. Basically says if someone's been convicted of an offence, various offences, the action for eviction, well, there would appear not to be any defence apart from proportionality. But I mean, I think that was accepted in the earlier session, but it seems a bit absurd that if people know that proportionality may be raised and may be an issue, not to explain it in statute in a way that is accountable, clear, the rule of law, then gives people clear indication. And as I said, if somebody goes to see a lawyer and says, you know, I want to defend the eviction, what are you accused of? Well, I attacked the next door neighbour with a hammer. Well, you know, perfectly reasonable. You're not going to get legal aid. You're not going to get anywhere. However, if it's more explanation of it, some time ago, tenants been rehabilitated, social work, GP, and everybody else says they've been rehabilitated. There is a reasonableness test argument, and that should be retained. And it would be a mistake to let it fall to proportionality challenges, because that's much more complex and it's going to be much more expensive for landlords. They're going to instruct advocates and, you know, go to appeal left, right and centre. Much better to have that put into the statute. I think we can be proud of the way that reasonableness test has been understood generally, and the courts do generally apply it where it exists, and the way that it's been explained in statute, and I think that principle should be built on rather than an attempt to remove it for hard cases. I think that's a mistake.
Gary, anything further to add?
I would suggest that to improve all tenants' rights is that you bring private sector tenancies' rights more in line with social sector tenancies, because it's a lot easier to get somebody out of a private let, and you've got examples of people who've been in the homes for 4, 5, 6, even longer years, and they can be out of there relatively quickly based on, you know, certain ways that the landlord can raise actions, and sometimes the action, there's not really a lot of evidence required to get somebody out, and it can be as short as, you know, 6 weeks, 2 months. And I think that can be quite unfair, particularly when there's families involved, because, you know, if you've been in a tenancy for 5 years, that's your home, and you think you're going to be there for a long time. And I think that we should put things more in line with the social sector. I also think that across Scotland, I think there is some really good third sector agencies and legal services that provide help for citizens. However, I think that there seems to be a bit of a mismatch on how that happens in places like Glasgow and Edinburgh. You know, there's services all over the place for people who are going through an eviction. There's a lot of expertise on how to stop that. But I think as you start going into the other smaller local authorities, there doesn't seem to be the same knowledge in that local authority how to access services. We've came across that because obviously there's been a lot of issues with the bedroom tax, and Government Law Centre has been in the media, and we are getting phone calls from all over Scotland. And although the bedroom tax is a certain issue, other issues come up, and that's because there isn't enough services in that are independent of the local authority and independent of government. I think that's something that's very important, because, you know, sometimes with agencies, when there's funding coming from government or funding coming from local authorities, that agency might not be great at challenging the local authority that's funding them, that they should be challenging based on their remit. So I think, just to kind of recap, is that to have more independent agencies that can fight for people's rights across Scotland, and to make private sector tenancies stronger for tenants.
Michael, do you have any views on it?
I'm afraid I'm very inexpert in this area and have to defer to the two experts on either side.
That's fine. I suspect I know what the answer to this question will be, because we've touched on the eviction process, and of course the bill simplifies that eviction process. So do you think that balances the rights of tenants and landlords, or does it swing too much in favour of one or the other?
I reckon that for the most vulnerable tenants, potentially quite a lot of rights are being removed by the bill. And I'm concerned about that. I don't understand why landlords appear to fear the legal process so much. I mean, I appreciate sometimes there are problems, but we've heard evidence they don't like it. They seem to think they don't get their remedies. I mean, that's not our experience at all. RSLs and local authorities in Scotland raise thousands of actions, sometimes on quite modest grounds, and they frequently get the remedy they're seeking. I'm not talking about rent arrears cases, which is more of a, but they frequently get the remedy they're seeking. So I'm concerned about the way that the changes to the triple ST regime could result in naive tenants and members of the family losing their homes or losing a lot of security without really understanding what's going on. So I'm concerned about it. Okay. I'm not in any way saying that all tenants should always stay in their homes. There are times when people need to be evicted. I'm not querying that. It's just a question of getting the balance right, and I appreciate it's not always easy.
Okay. Gary?
Any erosion or any policy that makes it easier for a landlord to evict a tenant should be avoided at all costs. I think it should be more difficult to evict. And again, I would mirror what Paul's saying, and that, you know, we're not sitting here saying that no matter what a tenant does, they have the right to this home that they're in. And that's not the point. I just think that when we go back to my original point about how most people that this happens to, these triple STs or ASBOs, there's something's happened, there's mental health, addictions, but also sometimes there's a breakdown in the relationship between the tenant and the landlord, and sometimes that can be really personal, and sometimes when there is that personal relationship, housing associations can dig their heels in, just like any organisation can. When they dig their heels in, the problem is if you're giving them more power, I feel that might not be the best interest of vulnerable tenants. And it's not to say that that's the practice in all social landlords, of course it's not, but when you've got relationships like that and they're so close, and there's a lot of pressures on social landlords now with rent and bedroom tax and things, a lot of them are breaking down, and I think that to give extra powers to evict isn't the best idea for tenants.
Okay, thanks. And just finally, do the panel have any other comments on part 2 of the bill that we've maybe not touched on, or anything you want to add?
Well,
Thank
then,
you.
Oh, sorry. Private part 2, the private rented housing sector. Jim, you've got some questions on that.
Thank you, Convener. Can I just kick off by asking if the panel have information that they can provide about housing cases, particularly those in the private rented sector, which are currently dealt with by the sheriff courts? And what are some of the problems in relation to the quality and access to justice?
One of the significant barriers to that is the actual private landlord themselves. We deal with people, illegal evictions, maybe a rough estimate is probably maybe about 5 or 6 a month. And when I say legal evictions, I mean a landlord changing somebody's locks or a landlord removing people's property from their home and putting it out in the street. The police then refuse to get involved in that. That's actually a criminal act. It's not a civil matter at all. Forcing a lock's a criminal act without a court order, and landlords are doing this routinely. The problem with that is that the people that they're doing this to tend to be people who are young, tend to be people who are female and mothers, and there's an element of kind of bullying in that, and persons not getting their rights. Now, I've spent days talking to police when this happens, and no action's been taken, and the person then gets fed up, because in the days that person's got a child, she's out in the street, she can't get into her house, her child's clothing and toys and beddings in there, she's having to go to her mother, where their relationship broke down a few years ago. And I think that stronger advice in terms for the police to take action in that is important.
In case the police refuse to intervene when a criminal act has been committed, so do you have experience of the other side of the...
In almost every case, I've had to spend a significant amount of time to the police, going through different types of officer to get the actual sergeant, so that I can report it as a crime. And even when it is reported as a crime, police come up and ask things like, has the person paid rent? Now, that's not an issue. The person's been evicted illegally. They're not there to make any judgments on rent. But usually the police do get involved, but unfortunately it can take a significant amount of time, and that person then has nowhere to go. In quite a lot of cases, the police haven't really done their jobs in that person. And there's been never ever been any prosecutions when there is significant evidence that a crime has been committed, real evidence, and there's never been a prosecution, to my understanding. Private landlords also don't like their tenants getting their rights. You know, they get quite huffy when you phone up and they say, why are they going to a law centre? Well, to get their rights. And I think private landlords, not all of them, because it would be unfair to blanket that, and some are decent. Private landlords need to know what they're doing. You know, you get people putting in a handwritten note saying you need to be out of this property by 12 o'clock in August, the 7th, and then you phone up and say, you know, that's not really a proper notice to quit. And then they come back to me and say, why is that not a notice to quit? I'm going to put them out. Well, actually, if you do that, you're breaking the law. And I think that, you know, private landlords have the right to put people out, of course they do, but they need to do it legally. And I love it when they do it legally, because it means that somebody's not out in the street, you know, terrified to be homeless. Is that?
Do the other witnesses have any perspective on that specific issue?
Our experience of private rent sector cases is that they can be very complex. Obviously, if the short assured tenancy is created and ended properly, there is no defence, but sometimes it's a lot more complex. In the case of long-running tenancies that predate the assured tenancy regime, you're looking at an earlier statutory regime. So it can be complex, and I would agree that there is a problem of landlord education. There is also a problem, and it's addressed to some extent in the bill, about repairs in certain sorts of stock. If the tenant only has a short assured tenancy, they don't really feel confident enough to take repairs issues up, because they think the tenancy will just be brought to an end and that's them out. But there is an issue about it, and also about common parts. So I think the improvements in the ideas about how tenemental repairs may be made easier will help private rented sector tenants as well. But I think the shelter was saying that they thought the long term has to be to look at the assured tenancy regime and increase the rights, the security of short assured tenants. I think that is something that would be worthwhile looking at.
Do you have any other perspective that you can share with the committee on your experience of how cases in the private rented sector are currently dealt with by sheriff courts?
We have little experience because there's very few tenants who consult us. We have done some unlawful eviction cases. They can be very difficult if the landlord's very intransigent. So there is an education issue there. I mean, my impression is that some sheriffs quite enjoy the really complex cases because they're getting their teeth into complex legal issues, but they're really quite few and far between at the moment.
Okay, perhaps I can move on then and ask, unless Mr. Clancy, you've got any?
Well, I was going to say that your question was also about access to justice, and that can frequently depend upon eligibility for legal aid, especially for tenants. Although there may be a wider eligibility for advice and assistance these days, legal aid availability is certainly more restrictive, and I think that is an area that does need looked at, but you know that it's a continual problem matching eligibility and availability.
Okay, can I ask then what the views of the panel are on the proposals contained in the bill to transfer certain types of civil court actions in relation to the private rented sector from Sheriff Court to the first tier tribunal?
Thank you, Convener. The Society is in favour of the way in which the Tribunal's bill is proceeding, currently at stage 2 in the Parliament, and we think that tribunals on the whole have a different ethos from courts. They're more accessible, they're more user-friendly, they can be more specialised, they're relatively less adversarial and relatively more inquisitorial in the way in which they do their business, and they're also quite informal. And I think that all of that adds up to a balance in favour of tribunals. And I know that under the Tribunals Act there is a chamber envisaged, a first-tier chamber for housing, land and property questions. I think there are two reservations which we've talked about just before the session began, and that relates to legal aid, because whilst legal aid is widely available for courts, and the Legal Aid Scotland Act 1986 Schedule 1 has a list of courts to which legal aid is available, there is a much shorter list of tribunals in that schedule, and the kind of tribunals that are in that schedule are employment law, tribunals and the Lands Tribunal for Scotland, one or two others. So I think we've got to be careful about the issue of ECHR compliance when it comes to shifting cases off to tribunals, where in the past going to a court one would have access to legal aid, and in the tribunal one might not have direct access to legal aid, although advice and assistance would be available in those circumstances. So I think that is a reservation. The other reservation...
Can I just ask you specifically on that point, because I think you raise an important point about access to justice through legal aid. Do you have a sense in transferring the jurisdiction from Sheriff Court to the newly established tribunal, whether that is something that would be cost neutral or whether there would be a cost implication attached, and if the latter, what that would be or how much that would be?
I think my capabilities in arithmetic and mathematics are so limited that I can't answer that question just now.
I don't believe that for the moment.
Well,
I don't believe there are any limits to your capabilities.
You're charming as ever, Mr. Reedy, and also overly optimistic. But what I will do is I'll take that question back and I'll have our Access to Justice team look at it and see if we can write to the committee in a later point during stage one. I think I was going to reflect on the fact that under Section 70 of the Tribunals Scotland Bill, there is a provision for Scottish ministers to be able to make regulations for tribunals to charge fees, and that too could be a barrier to using tribunals, which I think we've got to watch carefully. And of course, in court circumstances, already there are fees charged by the court for various steps in the process. So we just have to be aware of these possibilities.
Could the other panel members address the issue of legal aid and fees in the responses?
The provision of legal aid for a tribunal process is absolutely crucial. There will be a non-compliance with Article 6 if that is not the case. And I would also have thought that it would make life very difficult for the tribunal itself if none of the defenders in eviction cases in the private rented sector are represented. A proportion will have difficulties, communication difficulties, have no idea how to gather and deploy evidence or legal arguments. And we are talking about a family losing their home, which is a removal of a fundamental freedom, balanced with the obligation to pay rent and so forth, of course. But I think legal aid is absolutely crucial. On the cost, I would have thought at the moment, I'm taking a risk here, that the number of cases will not be very great because most tenancies are short-issue tenancies, and there won't be very many, if they're properly created and brought to an end, there won't be much of a defence for an eviction case. It would be a very different matter if the regime, the tenancy regime's changed, and to move on a bit, it will be an enormously different matter if registered social landlords' tenancies, secure tenancies, go through a tribunal process. I would imagine the cost would be very high indeed because of the sheer numbers. But there are positive advantages about tribunal in terms of programming, in terms of having an expert panel, and the perceived informality. I think sometimes it's not more informal than the courts. But I very much doubt if it really ends up by being cheaper where there is a really substantive defence. The private rented housing panel at the moment would not be used to having a case which would last 2-3 days with scores of witnesses. when that happens, I can't imagine it's going to be cheaper for landlords or for anyone else. That's my guess, anyway.
Okay, Mr. Burns.
We would be concerned at the loss of having a solicitor represent a tenant at these tribunals, which, from what I understand, is the whole point of the tribunals. And without having a sheriff who's, I'm not so sure, lacks the specialism that's put down in the kind of the briefing, I think that, you know, if we can go to see a sheriff for small amounts of figures, and he can make decisions on whether you've bought a dodgy sofa or not, are we saying that it's more important that he decides on that than he decides on somebody's home? That's what our concern would be, is that a person's home is really vital. You can't do anything in life without a strong home. And we think that you know, the panel, the tribunal, if so long as it doesn't have the power to evict, could be a good arbitration, but only as an arbitrator. If it comes to, you know, making a decision on an eviction, we feel that it should still stick with the sheriff courts as it is at the moment. That's what our ideas is. A wee bit of a disagreement between ourselves, but we're for different organisations, so that's fine. But we don't think it's a great idea moving into the tribunal system.
Okay, that's helpful. Perhaps we can pursue the need for clarification that you've highlighted. Can I, while I have you, ask you? You mentioned earlier in response to the question from Mr. Ingram about the level of rents in the private rented sector. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Well, we think that the level of rents just now in the private sector are very, very high in comparison to the social sector. You know, brick by brick, I guess is the best way of doing it. You know, a two-bedroom house in Glasgow can potential rent for that's about £600. You know, whereas their neighbour next door would be paying probably about half of that if it was in the social sector for the exact same flat. Now, we don't really see that's fair, and think that the government should take a role in dealing with this, because I guess for a lot of people, particularly those on minimum wage, most of their income goes in housing costs. And when most of your income goes in housing costs, and I was there myself not too long ago, it's no nice. It's no nice when you're paying half your wages to somebody else that's making quite a lot of money, and often is the case, it's providing a very, very poor service. Then when you start talking about the fact that actually, you know, we're putting all this, everybody talks about the housing benefit. I mean, the housing benefit bill's astronomical, but a lot of that comes from the private rented sector. You know, somebody's going in.
So what's the remedy that you're suggesting the Scottish Government should adopt? For the Scottish
Government to do a review, to look into this at a more deep level. I appreciate that maybe this isn't the greatest format to bring this to, but I think that a big review on rent, and if there is a legal way to do that, and that we would suggest that there is, and if there is a fair and just way of what we're talking about is capping rents, that's essentially what we're saying, in a very, you know, brutal way, that's what I'm saying, but basically I think there's a way that the Scottish Government can have a look at it and potentially use legislation to protect people from having to pay exorbitant rents from their income, and protect the public purse at the same time, because, you know, their rents get charged to people that are getting housing benefit to pay, and then they need to help up with their £70 a week benefits to pay off the rest of it, and people are in abject poverty. And I think that solving a high housing costs would free up a lot of money and make Scotland a far fairer society.
Okay. I've just got one final question in this section, and that's the government has proposals for court reform. Do you think that these would be able to achieve similar outcomes to those that are envisaged through the changes in transfer of jurisdiction from courts to tribunal in terms of efficiency and access to justice?
The court reform programme is a very broad, wide-ranging one, which has already begun in some respects, following on the report of Lord Gill, and there are other reports involved in that too, such as Sheriff Taylor's report and one or two others. So it's a very big programme to try to improve efficiency in the courts and to make sure that the right level of court deals with the right level of matter. And I think that, as we may see in earlier consultations on the courts bill, proposals to increase the threshold for jurisdiction of the Court of Session and to push cases into the Sheriff Court will mean that there will be more cases in the Sheriff Court. It then, if one tries to look at the civil justice system as a whole, including reforms to tribunals along with reforms to the courts, is a very sensible idea. Not only the structural aspect in terms of the Scottish Court Service and the Civil Justice Council, but also at a more operational level. And I think one can say from our point of view that shifting jurisdiction from the Sheriff Court to the tribunals, and it's not just in this area but in other areas as well, will actually perhaps allow for those cases which cascade from the Court of Session to go to the Sheriff Court and be more efficiently dealt with there. I hope that answers your question.
Okay. Gordon, do you have anything to add in this section?
I just wanted to ask one quick question, which is what's the panel's view on whether or not social rented sector cases should also be transferred to the first tier tribunal?
Opposition for it for private, so it kind of follows that we're going to be opposition for it for social sector, so I'll just not add anything else.
I didn't realise that this would be such a hot potato, and I would like to put in some written representations later in more detail, but I think the fundamental issue isn't whether it's a tribunal or a court. It's the resources that go on into the provision of the court or tribunal facilities, making sure that the judges, whether in a tribunal or in a sheriff court, know about the subject matter beforehand, and also that there's legal aid. In the past, I think it's less so now, there was a sort of idea that a tribunal meant you didn't have to have representation, and if you did have representation, it didn't need to be that expert. I think that's probably going. It has not entirely gone. You do hear stories of people being represented at employment tribunals where very large sums of money involved. A lot of it can be very intimate, very upsetting for people, and they're represented by people who have no knowledge or experience of that form of remedy at all. Sometimes they're solicitors, but the point is that sometimes they're not. And I think if it's done with a degree of seriousness, legal aid is provided, proper legal aid, not some not a sort of edited version. Full legal aid is provided, and the right messages are given about the seriousness and importance and power of the tribunal. I'm fairly neutral. We, Legal Services Agency, appear before a wide range of tribunals and courts. In fact, some of my colleagues are mental health tribunal chairs. They've got huge powers. I don't have any difficulty in principle with that route, as long as people don't think that that's an easy, cheaper way of doing it. As it appears the landlords appear to think that will be the case. It won't be. If there's a tribunal with 3 experts, they may spend a lot longer on difficult cases than a sheriff court may. So I'm not against it, but it needs to be done with one's eyes open.
The rest of my questions have been covered.
You've got some questions on other matters in private rent.
Yep, just on the private rented sector, what would your views be on expanding access to the private rented housing panel by enabling third-party applications by local authorities to enforce the repairing standard?
Wait.
You've got a consensus there.
That's good, that was an easy one. If I can come on to letting agents, and I know that the Law Society's submission had quite a high focus on that, just to ask if you agree that the regulation of letting agents is required, and if so, why?
Oh, my lights come on. I hadn't even said anything. Yes, we do agree with the regulation of letting agents. We think that the policy intention is quite a clear one, and one which we would support. I think what we have an issue with is the way in which this regulatory scheme is being set up, and the extent of regulation by Scottish ministers of letting agents, and the functions which the Scottish ministers would perform as regulators. Those are our issues with this, and also the inclusion of solicitors in the regulatory scheme at present.
You would hope that solicitors would be excluded from that scheme?
Well, I think if one looks at the scheme as it is in the bill, you can see that the Scottish ministers have to establish a register of letting agents, that it's going to be a criminal offence not to register and yet to act as a letting agent. And in order to be on the register, you have to be a fit and proper person, which amounts to not being convicted of an offence involving dishonesty, violence, drugs, firearms, or as a sexual offence, or to have practised unlawful discrimination under the Equality Act, or otherwise to have contravened the law on housing, on private rental, or landlord and tenant law, or the law relating to debt. And all of these things add up to being a fit and proper person. But there's no mention in section 30 of the bill of qualifications or training. There's no mention of client protections, consumer protections, which would apply. There is a code of practice which ministers are to provide, and that will apply to letting agents. But from our point of view, solicitors already have a fairly extensive fit and proper test to become solicitors. They're regulated by the practice rules and code of practice, code of conduct approved by the Lord President of the Court of Session. They have an independent complaints body, the Scottish Legal Complaints Commission, to which complaints should be sent, and which commission can award, for example, an order of compensation of up to £20,000, repayment of fees and expenses, and take certain other action against the solicitor. And none of that seems to apply to letting agents under this bill. So I think we have reservations about the robustness of the regulatory system under the bill as it applies to letting agents on their own. And we think that this scheme shouldn't apply to solicitors because we already have a very robust, structured system of regulation, which we think is a significant improvement on what is in the bill.
Panel members, any comments?
Can I comment on some of the drafting points in the bill? Because I think just so that it's on the record, Convener, if you don't mind, I think we already have had discussions with the bill team, and we've offered to give the bill team all the assistance which they want from us. So we want to continue that dialogue. But things like contravening any provision of the law relating to housing, or landlord and tenant law, or the law relating to debt, which one finds in Section 30, it's quite difficult to actually find out what that means when you contravene the law relating to housing. I'm not really sure what one might say about that, or how you would interpret that. And when that is one of the strands which goes to contribute to you being a fit and proper person, then we've got to look very carefully about that. I think also that the business of being a letting agent, if one looks at section 50, I think it is, which has the definition of no, sorry, I'm misleading you. Where have I got it? It's in the definition of being a letting agent that you're doing work which letting agency work 51 means things done by a person who is not defined in the course of that person's business in response to instructions which are carried out with a view to a landlord who is a relevant person entering into a lease so that an unconnected person may use the landlord's house as a dwelling. That seems to be quite limited. It sounds like it only relates to the landlord's house, landlord's own house. And I think one would want to look carefully at that to make sure that it's broad enough to achieve its intention. And also letting agency would be getting instructions to repair, maintain, improve, insure, or otherwise manage a house. So this could mean, and without being too flippant, that someone who is repairing a house, a roofer, or someone who knows about drainage could be described as carrying out letting agency work, or someone maintaining a house. So a painter and decorator. I think we've got to be very precise about how this is worded and how it actually fits together so that those who are actually doing letting agency work are captured and those who are not doing letting agency work are not. And in that, in the submission which I made, I point out that there's a private members' bill currently going through the Westminster Parliament, the Private Landlords and Letting and Management Agents Deregulation Bill. I don't know how far this bill will get, but it was high up the ballot in the House of Commons, so you never know. And I think that with a little bit of modification of the wording in that definition of letting agents work in that bill, we might be able to improve this bill. Significantly, that UK or English legislation is treated as an amendment to the Estate Agents Act 1979, and the Estate Agents Act 1979 does not apply to solicitors. So therefore, again, to reinforce the point that we already have as a profession, a group of client protections and adequate code of conduct, robust code of conduct, I think we've got to be aware that we would create an unlevel playing field in this particular area across the UK at the moment. Of course, that might change after September.
Okay, does anyone else have any sort of further comments on any other parts of the bill, parts 6 or 7 of the bill, or any other issues in general? Just finally, on part 5, which is about mobile home sites with permanent residents, do you have any comments on that part at all? No. Okay, any members got any further questions? All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for that, and we look forward to further detail that some of you might have said that you would like to send in. But thank you very much. And can I briefly suspend the meeting to allow members, witnesses to leave the room, for members to stay because we're moving into private business. Thank you.